My family threw me out with nothing when I was 18, because in the Ellington family, the men used to say, "Girls don't inherit." 10 years later, they called an emergency board meeting to introduce the anonymous investor who'd quietly acquired 51% of the company and was the only thing standing between the Ellington dynasty and bankruptcy. They rolled out the red carpet for their mysterious savior. Not one of them recognized the daughter they'd discarded. Not until I walked past the savior's empty chair, kept walking, and sat down in my father's. Let me set the scene properly, because the silence in that boardroom when I sat in the chairman's seat is a silence I waited 10 years to hear, and you should hear it the way I did. My name is Clara Ellington. Claire, to the 3 people in the world I let call me anything. The Beaumonts are an old industrial dynasty, the kind with a name carved over the door of a tower downtown, and a 100-year story they tell at galas about grit and vision and the great men who built it all. The story they tell is a lie, but I'll get to that. The important thing to understand first is the shape of the family I was born into, because the shape is the whole reason I'm telling you this from the chairman's chair instead of from a gutter, which is where they left me to die. My father is Arthur Finch, and Arthur Finch believed, with the unexamined certainty of a man who has never once been wrong in his own estimation, that the Ellington legacy passed from father to son, that daughters were assets to be married off into useful alliances, and that a woman with opinions about business was a woman who had forgotten her place. He had 2 sons he adored, and 1 daughter he tolerated, and the daughter was me. My mother died when I was 12, and after that the tolerating curdled into something colder, especially once my father remarried. My stepmother Vivian arrived with a son of her own from a previous marriage, Julian, and a niece, Isabella, and from the moment she crossed the threshold, she understood the family math perfectly. There was a finite amount of inheritance and affection, and every share that went to Arthur's troublesome daughter was a share that didn't go to her own boy. Vivian was not loud about it. The dangerous ones never are. She simply, patiently, over 6 years, rearranged the family around my absence, until by the time I was 18, I was less a daughter than a problem everyone had agreed to stop seeing. And then there were my brothers. Leo, the eldest, the golden heir, groomed from birth to take the chairman's seat, a man who confused being given everything with having earned anything. And Julian, my stepbrother, who Vivian had positioned as the spare, the backup heir, spoiled into uselessness. Between Leo and Julian, the Ellington succession was considered settled. 2 sons, a dynasty secured, and a daughter who simply did not figure into the equation at all, except as a line item to be optimized. I figured into it exactly once, decisively, on the night of my 18th birthday, which is the night they threw me out. I won't dramatize it because the truth is dramatic enough. There had been a will, not my father's, my grandmother's. And my grandmother, Lillian Hawthorne, is the part of this story that the family's 100-year gala speech leaves out. So let me put her back in, because everything I am, everything I built, everything that brought me to the chairman's chair traces back to her. The Ellington Group was not built by great men. It was built by one great woman, my grandmother Lillian, who founded it from nothing in an era when women were not permitted to sign their own loan documents, who built an industrial empire with her own mind and her own hands, while her husband's name went on the letterhead because the banks required a man's signature. She built it, and then she watched the men of the family she'd married into take the credit for it, decade by decade, until the official history erased her so completely that the gala speech credited the founding to her husband, my great-grandfather, who had in fact done little but sign where Lillian told him to sign. She knew she was being erased. She watched it happen, and she did the only thing she could to fight it. She found, among her descendants, the one child who had her mind, and she trained that child in secret, for years, in everything she knew, so that the empire she'd built would not be entirely lost to the men who'd stolen the credit for it. That child was me. From the time I was 8, my grandmother taught me. Not dolls, not deportment, not the things Vivian would later try and fail to interest me in. She taught me capital. She taught me how an empire actually works under the speeches, the leverage and the cash flow and the cold arithmetic of power. The same things she'd taught herself in an age that told her she wasn't allowed to know them. "They'll tell you girls don't inherit, Claire," she said to me once, when I was 15 and she was dying, gripping my hand with fingers that had built a 100-year company. They told me the same thing. So I built one anyway, and I'll teach you to build one too, because the only inheritance that can't be taken from you is the one inside your own head. They can throw you out of the house. They cannot throw you out of what you know. Remember that. They'll try to take everything. Make sure the most important thing is the one thing they can't reach. She died when I was 15, and in her will, she left her personal shares in the Ellington Group, a significant minority block, not to her son Arthur and not to her grandsons Leo and Julian, but to me. To the granddaughter she'd trained in secret. It was the last act of a woman who'd been erased her whole life, a final attempt to put the empire she'd built into the hands of the one descendant who understood what it actually was. My father contested the will. Of course he did. And here is the cruelty that made me who I am. He didn't just contest it. He used it as the reason to be rid of me entirely. On the night of my 18th birthday, the will having been tied up in the courts that the Ellington money owned, my father sat me down and told me that my grandmother had clearly been senile at the end, that no Ellington woman had ever held shares, and none ever would, that I had been poisoning the family with my unnatural ambitions and my refusal to know my place, and that I was no longer welcome in the Ellington home. Vivian watched with her patient, cold satisfaction. Leo didn't bother to come downstairs. And my father had security walk me to the gate with a single suitcase and the clothes I was wearing. And he told me, as the gate closed, the sentence that I have carried like a coal in my chest for 10 years. Girls don't inherit, Clara. You'll learn that the hard way out there with nothing. The Ellington name is for the men who can carry it. Don't come back. I was 18 years old with a suitcase and no money and a dead grandmother's voice in my head, standing outside the gate of the only home I'd ever known, disowned for the crime of having been left an inheritance by the one person who'd ever seen my worth. I did not cry. I want you to know that. I stood at that gate and I did not cry, because my grandmother had given me something the night she died that my father had just proven he could never take. The one thing they can't reach. And standing there with nothing, I made a decision. The cold, clean decision that organized the next 10 years of my life. I was not going to come back as a daughter begging to be let in. I was going to come back as the owner. The next 10 years are a different story, a longer one, and I'll tell you pieces of it as we go because the how matters. But here is the shape of it. I took the only inheritance they couldn't reach, everything Lillian had poured into my head, and I went to the other side of the world where the Ellington name meant nothing, and I built. Quietly, patiently. The way my grandmother taught me, the way she'd had to do it herself, in the shadows, letting the men assume the work was being done by someone else. I started with nothing and I compounded it into something, and then into something larger. And then, over 10 years, into one of the largest privately held investment groups in the world. A firm I built under a name that had nothing to do with Ellington. A firm the financial press knew only through its reclusive, faceless chairman. A figure they'd nicknamed because no one had ever seen her and no one knew her name. The Strategist. The Strategist was me. Halcyon Group was mine. And almost no one on Earth knew that the mysterious colossus quietly reshaping industries from the shadows was a woman the Ellington family had thrown out of the house at 18 with a single suitcase, because girls don't inherit. I built Halcyon for 10 years, and about 18 months ago, I turned its attention for the first time toward home. Because while I was building, the men of the Ellington family were destroying. My father aged into stubbornness, and then into illness, his grip loosening. Leo, the golden heir, took the chairman's seat he'd been groomed for his whole life and proved, with breathtaking speed, that being given everything teaches you nothing about how to keep it. He made bad bets. He took on debt to fund vanity projects. He surrounded himself with people who flattered him and fired anyone who told him the truth, the same people my grandmother had hired, the loyal ones who actually knew how the company worked. Julian, elevated by Vivian to a senior position he was catastrophically unequipped for, embezzled and hid it badly. And the 100-year empire that Lillian Hawthorne had built with her mind and her hands began, under the careful stewardship of the men who'd inherited it because they were men, to die. I watched it happen from the shadows, through Halcyon, with the patience my grandmother taught me. And 18 months ago, when the Ellington Group's troubles became real, when the debt became unsustainable and the cash ran short, and the men who'd thrown me out started, quietly, desperately, looking for a savior to keep their dynasty from collapsing, I began, through layers of structure they could never trace, to buy. I bought their debt. I bought their shares as the price fell. I bought patiently, invisibly, through vehicles that led nowhere, until 18 months of careful accumulation had given me what no Ellington woman had ever been permitted to hold, and what my grandmother had died trying to give me: control. 51% of the Ellington Group. A majority. The company my grandmother built and the men stole, back in the hands of the woman they'd thrown out. And not one of them knew it, because the strategist had no face, and Halcyon had no obvious connection to the daughter they'd discarded and forgotten. And then I let them call the meeting. I could have simply seized control. With 51%, I didn't need their permission for anything. But I wanted the room. I wanted the meeting. I wanted my father and my brothers and my stepmother and my cousin gathered in the boardroom of the company my grandmother built, desperate, on the edge of ruin, waiting to be rescued by a mysterious savior they'd never met, so that the savior could walk in and they could see, all of them, at once, exactly who they'd thrown away. So I let my proxies arrange it. An emergency board meeting to introduce the anonymous majority investor who would announce a rescue plan and take a controlling role. The family was told only that their savior was coming, a reclusive figure of enormous wealth, their last hope. They prepared the boardroom. They prepared their gratitude. Vivian, I'm told, ordered flowers. Leo prepared a presentation designed to convince the savior to keep him in his chair. They had no idea. They sat around the long table in the boardroom of Lillian Hawthorne's empire, my father gray and ill at the head of it, but still, by habit, in the chairman's seat, and they waited for the stranger who would save them. And the door opened, and I walked in. I watched them look at me and not know me at first. 10 years is a long time. The 18-year-old girl they'd walked to the gate had become a woman in a quiet, perfect, devastatingly expensive suit. A woman who moved through their boardroom the way you move through a room you own, which I did. They saw the strategist, the savior, the mysterious colossus. They half rose, ready with their gratitude, their flowers, their presentations, my father pushing himself up on trembling arms. And I walked past the empty chair they'd set out for their honored guest, the guest chair, the visitor's chair. And I kept walking, toward the head of the table, toward the chairman's seat where my gray, ill father sat, and I stopped beside him, and I looked down at the man who'd told me 10 years ago at a closing gate that girls don't inherit. "Get up, father," I said quietly. "You're in my chair." And then I watched it happen. I watched recognition crash over the faces around that table, one by one, as the savior's features resolved in their minds into the daughter they'd thrown away. I watched my father's face go from confusion to disbelief, to a horror so complete it was almost beautiful. I watched Vivian go white. I watched Leo's mouth fall open. And I stood at the head of the table, in the boardroom of the empire my grandmother built and the men stole and ran into the ground, holding 51% of it in my hand. And I gave them the only greeting they had earned in 10 years. "Hello," I said. "You said girls don't inherit. I want you all to know that I agree completely. We don't inherit." I pulled out the chairman's chair as my father rose from it on shaking legs, and I sat down, and I folded my hands on the table that was now mine, and I finished my grandmother's sentence, the one she'd whispered to me when I was 15 and dying and refusing to be erased. We build, and then we take back what was built. Now, let's begin the meeting. There's a great deal to discuss about the future of this company, and from this moment forward, every decision about that future is going to be made by me. The boardroom erupted, in the restrained way that boardrooms erupt, which is to say, no one shouted, but everyone's composure cracked at once, and I sat in my grandmother's chair and let it break over me like weather, because I had waited 10 years, and I was in no hurry at all. Leo recovered first, because Leo had spent his whole life being certain. And certainty is a hard habit to lose, even when the floor is gone. This is absurd," he said, half laughing, the golden air reaching for the dismissiveness that had always worked before. "Clara." How are you? You can't just walk in here and... This is a board meeting of the Ellington Group. You're not even... You have no standing to— I have 51% of standing, Leo, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I never raise my voice. My grandmother taught me that the person who needs volume has already lost the argument. Halcyon Group, of which I am the founder, chairman, and sole controlling owner, holds 51% of the voting shares of the Ellington Group, acquired over the past 18 months entirely legally through open market purchases and debt conversions. Every one of them documented and filed. I am the majority owner of this company, which means I am, as of the moment I sat down, its controlling shareholder. And under the bylaws this family wrote, the controlling shareholder appoints the chairman. I let that land. I'm appointing myself. The vote, if you'd like to hold one for the formality, will be 51 to 49. Would you like to hold it, or shall we save everyone the time? The silence that followed was the silence of a room full of people doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. Because every person at that table understood, slowly, what I had just said. Not that I was claiming the company, that I already had it. That the meeting they'd called to be rescued by a stranger had become the meeting where they learned the stranger owned them. My father had not spoken. He sat in the chair beside the one I'd taken, the chair he'd been demoted to, gray and ill and staring at me with an expression I'd waited 10 years to see and found, now that I saw it, more complicated than I'd expected. Not just shock. Something underneath the shock, something that looked, impossibly, like a man recognizing a ghost. Lillian, he said very quietly, almost to himself, you sound exactly like her. You sit exactly like her. My God. Clara, what did you do? I did what she trained me to do, I said. The thing you all decided a girl couldn't. Now sit there and be quiet, Father. You ran your part of this story 10 years ago, at a gate. This part is mine. Vivian found her voice next, and Vivian, being the most dangerous mind in the family after my own, did not bluster like Leo or freeze like my father. She went straight to the attack, smooth and cold. Even if this is true, she said, even if you've somehow acquired these shares, you cannot possibly expect this board, this family, to simply hand a company of this size and complexity to a woman who's been gone for 10 years, who has no experience running an industrial enterprise, who left as a teenager and has, what, played at finance somewhere overseas? The Ellington Group employs 40,000 people. This is not a game, Clara. Sentiment and revenge are not a business plan. You may own the shares, but owning is not running. And the moment your inexperience becomes clear, the board, the creditors, the regulators will all— Vivian, I said, and I smiled at her, the first smile I'd allowed myself, because she had just handed me the opening I'd been waiting for. You think I played at finance overseas? I opened the slim folder I'd brought, the only prop I needed. Let me tell you what I actually did. I'll be brief because we have real work to do and you're all going to need the time to process this. I slid the first page to the center of the table. Halcyon Group, founded by me from nothing 10 years ago. Currently one of the 40 largest privately held investment groups in the world. Assets under management exceeding the entire market capitalization of the Ellington Group by a factor of roughly 30. I am, by any measure you'd care to use, one of the wealthiest and most successful industrialists alive, and I have been for years. And the only reason none of you knew it is that I built it the way my grandmother had to build this, in the shadows, without a name attached, because I learned from watching her exactly what men like the men at this table do to a woman who lets her success become visible. I looked around the room. So when you say owning is not running, Vivian, understand that I have spent 10 years running enterprises that make this company look like a lemonade stand. The inexperience you're counting on does not exist. I am the most experienced person in this room by an order of magnitude, and the only reason you can't believe that is the exact same reason you threw me out. You've spent your whole lives unable to imagine that a Ellington woman could be the most capable person in any room. That failure of imagination is why this company is dying, and it's why I'm the one who gets to decide whether it lives. I let the room absorb the scale of it. I watched them recalculate, watched the dismissiveness they'd reached for evaporate as the numbers on the page made it impossible to maintain. And then I moved to the part I'd actually come for, the part that wasn't about me at all, the part that was about them. Now, I said, let's talk about why we're here. Let's talk about why the Ellington Group, a 100-year-old industrial empire with no natural reason to fail, is 18 months from bankruptcy and had to go begging to a mysterious stranger for rescue. Because the story you've been telling the creditors and the press is that it's the economy, market conditions, bad luck, forces beyond anyone's control. I turned to my brother. It's not the economy, Leo. It's you. And I can prove every word of it because I've spent 18 months reading every document this company has produced, and I know its finances better than anyone who's ever worked here, because reading the truth under the numbers is the one thing I do better than anyone alive. And then I laid it out, surgically, page by page, the autopsy of a dynasty's decline, and I watched the golden heir's face curdle as his sister read his failures into the record of the company he'd been handed. The vanity acquisitions Leo had made to look like a visionary, every one of them overpriced and underperforming, draining cash the company didn't have. The loyal executives my grandmother had hired, the ones who actually understood the operations, fired one by one because they'd told Leo uncomfortable truths, replaced by flatterers who told him what he wanted to hear. The debt, layered on to fund the vanity and paper over the losses, until the interest alone was strangling the company the way Sebastian Thorne had once strangled a small supplier. Except this time, the strangler and the victim were the same family. And underneath all of it, the rot I'd been saving. The page I laid down last, in front of Vivian, in front of Julian, the one that turned the temperature of the room from humiliation to genuine fear. And then there's the embezzlement, I said. Julian, would you like to explain it, or shall I? Julian, my stepbrother, who'd been silent and sweating since I sat down, went the specific shade of white that guilty men go when the thing they've hidden is suddenly on the table. I don't know what your $4.2 million, I said, routed through a vendor that doesn't exist over 3 years, into accounts that trace back to you, with Vivian's signature on 2 of the approvals, which means either she was helping you, or she wasn't checking what she signed, and I'm honestly not sure which is worse. I looked at my stepmother, whose smooth, cold composure had finally, fully cracked. The company is dying, Vivian, because the men you fought so hard to install in it, the son you positioned and the stepson you elevated, looted it and mismanaged it and surrounded themselves with people who'd never tell them the truth. You spent 6 years rearranging this family to make sure the inheritance went to your boy instead of the girl who actually understood the business. Congratulations, you won. And your prize was watching your boy and Arthur's golden son run a 100-year empire into the ground in a decade, while the granddaughter who could have saved it built a company 30 times its size on the other side of the world. That's the cost of girls don't inherit, Vivian. You didn't just throw away a daughter, you threw away the only Ellington in 3 generations who could actually run this company, and you kept the ones who destroyed it. And now you've all had to come crawling to a stranger to be saved, and the stranger is her. I closed the folder. The irony is so complete I almost feel sorry for you. Almost. The room was silent in the particular way a room goes silent when everyone in it has just understood that the floor is gone, and the person who removed it is the one person they can't argue with, because she owns the building. My father spoke again, and his voice had changed. The bluster was gone. The certainty was gone, and what was left was an old, ill man looking at the wreckage of his certainties. What are you going to do? He asked. Not a challenge, a real question. Now that you have it, now that you've won, are you going to do to us what we did to you? Throw us out? Strip the name off the building? Burn it all down to make the point? He looked at me, and there was something in his face I'd never seen there in 18 years of being his daughter. The dawning, terrible respect of a man who'd told a child she'd amount to nothing and was now sitting in the wreckage of how wrong he'd been. You could. You have every right. We gave you nothing and you built everything and we have nothing left to fight you with. So what are you going to do, Clara? And I looked at my father, and at the room full of the people who'd discarded me, and I gave them the answer that my grandmother would have wanted. The answer that was colder and more complete than burning it down. The answer that would take the rest of this story to fully deliver. I'm going to do the one thing none of you ever did, I said. I'm going to run this company the way it was meant to be run, by the person it was meant to go to. I'm going to save the 40,000 people you put at risk with your vanity and your theft. I'm going to undo the damage, restore the operations, and rebuild the empire my grandmother actually built, the one the gala speeches credit to her husband, the one the men of this family stole the credit for and then ran into the ground. I stood, slowly, in the chairman's chair that was finally, rightfully, mine. And I'm going to do all of it with the Ellington name on the building, Father, not because the name belongs to you, because the name was always hers. Lillian Hawthorne built this. The men just borrowed her name and called it theirs. I'm taking it back, and I'm putting it where it always belonged, in the hands of the woman who can actually carry it. I looked around the room, at the discarded daughter's audience of the people who'd discarded her. As for what happens to each of you, that depends entirely on what each of you actually is, which I'm going to find out, in detail, over the coming weeks. The embezzlers will answer for the embezzlement. The incompetent will be removed from positions they were never qualified for. And the ones who are capable of being useful, if any of you are, will have the chance to prove it, under me, on my terms, the way I never got a chance to prove anything under you. I gathered the folder. The meeting is adjourned. I'll be in the chairman's office, which is being cleared for me as we speak. Leo, you're relieved of your position as chairman, effective immediately. Julian, security will escort you to discuss the $4.2 million. Everyone else, go home and think very carefully about what you're worth, because for the first time in this family's history, worth is the only thing that's going to determine what you get. Not gender, not birth order, not whose son you are. Worth. I walked toward the door, and I paused, and I gave them the line I'd carried to that gate 10 years ago and back. Girls don't inherit. You were right about that, Father. We don't inherit. We earn, we build, and we come back and take what was ours all along. Remember that. I have a feeling it's going to be the family motto from now on. I want to take you back, before the boardroom, before the strategist, before any of it, to a child sitting at her grandmother's knee, because everything I am was made in those afternoons, and because you cannot understand the woman in the chairman's chair until you understand the girl who was trained in secret to one day sit in it. I was 8 the first time my grandmother closed the door of her study and taught me something the men of the family would have forbidden. I remember it precisely. She had a ledger open on her desk, a real one, the actual finances of a division of the company, and she pointed at a number and asked me what I thought it meant. And when I gave a child's answer, she didn't correct me the way adults correct children, with condescension. She corrected me the way you correct a colleague, with respect, as if my being wrong were a temporary and interesting condition rather than a permanent state of being 8. Look again, she said. The number isn't the thing. The number is the shadow the thing casts. Learn to see the thing. And I looked again, and slowly, over months and then years, I learned to see the thing, the reality under the numbers, the truth that capital casts a shadow of, and it became the one skill I have that no one else in finance quite matches. And my grandmother gave it to me in a locked study when I was a child, because she had nowhere else to put it. She was, I understand now, desperately lonely, my grandmother. She had built an empire and been forbidden from being known for it, had spent 50 years watching men sign where she told them to sign and then take the credit at the galas, had been erased in real time, decade after decade, by the family she'd married into and the world she'd built in. And she had no one to talk to about the one thing that was most truly hers, the empire, because the men didn't want to hear that she understood it better than they did, and the women of her generation had been trained out of the language entirely. So when she found, in her granddaughter, a child with her mind, a girl who lit up at a ledger the way other children lit up at toys, she didn't just see an heir. She saw, I think, the first person in 50 years who could actually understand her. The first witness to the real Lillian, the builder, the one the gala speeches erased. And the afternoons in the locked study weren't only training. They were the only place either of us was fully real. She was teaching me to inherit an empire, yes, but she was also, for the first time in her long, erased life, simply being known by a child who saw the thing and not the shadow, who saw her grandmother and not the silent woman behind the man's signature. They'll try to take it from you, she told me, again and again in those afternoons as I grew from 8 to 15. The way they took the credit from me. They'll tell you a girl can't, a woman shouldn't, it's not your place. They told me all of it. So learn everything, Claire. Learn it so deep they can't argue with it. because the one thing they can't take is the thing inside your head. And the day will come when knowing the thing better than all of them is the only weapon you have, and it will be enough if you've learned it deep enough. Learn it deep enough. And I did. I learned it deep enough. I sat in that locked study from 8 to 15 and learned the empire so deep that 10 years later, thrown out with a suitcase, I could rebuild the knowing into a fortune of my own. Because she was right. The way she was right about everything. They took the house, the name, the shares, the inheritance, everything they could reach. They never could reach the locked study. They never could reach the thing inside my head. She'd made sure of it. She died when I was 15, and I was the only one who grieved her truly, because I was the only one who'd known her truly. And at the funeral, the family told the gala story, the great man story, the lie. And I stood at her grave and made a child's vow that I would someday make the truth loud. A vow I kept, 12 years later, in a lobby, with her real portrait and the word founder. But that was far away. First there was the will, and the buried letter, and the gate, and the suitcase, and the 10 years. I've told you about the gate. Let me tell you about the suitcase, the first year, the part that made the cold permanent, because the cold wasn't born in the locked study. The study was warm. The study was love. The cold was born in the year after the gate, and I want you to see it, because the cold is the thing people most misunderstand about me, and the year is where it was forged. I was 18, in a city across the world, with a suitcase and almost no money, and the first thing I learned was that the world does not care about your grandmother's locked study, or your buried inheritance, or the injustice of your gate. The world only cares whether you can pay for the room. I couldn't at first. I want to be honest about how close to the bottom I went, because the people who meet the strategist now, the colossus, the woman who takes apart sharks without raising her voice, cannot imagine that she once counted coins to decide between food and the bus, and slept in places I won't describe, and learned, in her flesh, the exact texture of having nothing. The thing my grandmother had always had servants between herself and, the thing none of my family had ever touched. I touched it. For a year, I lived at the bottom of the world my family floated above, and it taught me two things that became the foundation of everything I built. The first was that I would never be powerless again. Not the abstract vow of a humiliated teenager at a gate, but the absolute cellular knowledge of a person who has been genuinely without, who has felt the specific terror of having no floor, and has decided, with everything in her, that she will build a floor so deep and so wide that she never touches that terror again, and neither does anyone she chooses to protect. That's where the cold was born. Not in hatred of my family, in the terror of the first year, and the vow to never feel it again, and the understanding that the only thing that stands between a person and that terror is capital, the real power, the thing my grandmother worshipped and taught me to worship, the floor under everything. The second thing the year taught me was the thing that made me better than every competitor I'd ever face. I understood money from the bottom. The men I'd eventually take apart, the Sterlings, the Marcuses, the loud, certain men, had only ever seen capital from above, as an abstraction on a screen, a thing that belonged to them by right and always had. I had seen it from below, as the difference between eating and not, as the thing whose absence is terror and whose presence is the only safety the world offers. And a person who has seen money from below and then learns to see it from above, the way my grandmother taught me, has a stereoscopic vision of capital that the people who've only ever seen it from above can never match. I could read a market the way you read a face, because I'd been on every side of money there is, the locked study and the gutter, and eventually the heights, and the men who'd only ever known the heights were, against me, like people who'd only ever seen a thing from one angle trying to outmaneuver someone who'd seen it from all of them. I made my first real money in the second year, and I've told you I didn't spend it or celebrate it, I compounded it. And that discipline came straight from the first year too, because a person who's known real terror doesn't celebrate a little safety. She builds toward never being unsafe again, and the building is patient and cold and relentless in a way that people who've never been to the bottom can't sustain, because they don't have the terror behind them, pushing. My family gave me the terror. It was the only thing they ever gave me, and it turned out to be, in the cold arithmetic my grandmother taught me, the most valuable inheritance of all, the one they didn't mean to give and couldn't take back, the fuel of everything. They threw me into the terror to destroy me, and the terror built me, because I had my grandmother's locked study in my head and her voice saying, "Learn it deep enough." And between the knowing and the terror, the warm thing she gave me and the cold thing they gave me, there was nothing I couldn't build. I think about her every day, in the chairman's chair, under her restored portrait. I think about the lonely woman in the locked study, building an empire she wasn't allowed to be known for, pouring 50 years of erased brilliance into a child because the child was the only one who could see her. I think about how she died believing, hoping, that the locked study would be enough, that the thing inside my head would survive whatever the men did, and how she was right, and how it was the closest thing to immortality a woman of her time and place could buy. A granddaughter, trained in secret, who would carry the knowing through the gate and the terror and the 10 years and come back and make the truth loud at last. She bet everything on me. The lonely, erased builder bet her whole legacy on a girl, against all the men and all the doctrine and all the certainty that girls don't inherit. And she won the bet, 12 years after her death, in a boardroom, in a lobby, in a chair that was always hers. That's who trained the strategist. A lonely genius in a locked study who saw a child clearly when no one else would, and gave her everything, and was right. Everything cold in me was forged in the year after the gate. But everything that aimed the cold, everything that made it build instead of destroy, catch instead of strip, correct the history instead of just seizing the company, all of that came from the warm afternoons in the study, from a grandmother's love, from the one place in either of our lives where we were both fully, finally, seen. The cold is the weapon. The study is the reason. And I have spent my whole life being the second thing wielding the first, which is, I think, exactly what she trained me to be, in the locked room when I was 8, learning to see the thing and not the shadow. To understand why I came back the way I came back, cold and complete and owning everything, you have to understand the 10 years between the gate and the boardroom, and you have to understand that I did not spend a single day of them planning revenge. That surprises people. They imagine a decade of seething, a woman nursing a grudge into a weapon. It wasn't like that. Revenge is hot, and my grandmother taught me that hot things are wasteful. I didn't spend 10 years planning to destroy the Beaumonts. I spent 10 years building something so much larger than them that, when I finally turned back toward home, taking the company was less an act of vengeance than an afterthought. The way a person returning to their childhood town might buy the house they grew up in, not out of spite, but simply because they can, and because it should have been theirs all along. Here is how a girl with a suitcase becomes the strategist. The first year was survival, and I won't romanticize it. 18 years old, no money, no name, in a city on the other side of the world chosen precisely because the Ellington name meant nothing there. I worked. I worked jobs that the daughter of an industrial dynasty was not supposed to know how to work, and I learned things in those jobs that no business school teaches. The actual texture of how money moves at the bottom, how the people who have nothing make decisions, what desperation does to judgment. Knowledge that would later make me far better at reading markets than any of my competitors who'd only ever seen capital from above. My grandmother had taught me the theory of empire. The first year taught me the ground it stands on. Between the two, I had something almost no one in finance has. I understood money from the bottom and the top at once. And the whole time, in a cheap room at night, I studied. Everything Lillian had poured into my head, I deepened. Everything I didn't know, I taught myself. I had her voice for a tutor, 10 years dead and still the sharpest mind I'd ever encountered, saying the things she'd said when I was a child at her knee. They'll tell you girls don't inherit, so build something they can't take. The only inheritance that can't be reached is the one inside your head. And the deepest thing she ever taught me, the thing that became the foundation of everything, power isn't loud, Claire. The loud ones are performing power because they don't actually have it. Real power is quiet, because it doesn't need anyone to believe in it. It simply is. Be quiet. Be the thing that simply is. So I was quiet. I made my first real money in the second year, a small trade, a thing I saw that others didn't because I could read the truth under the numbers. And I did the thing that separates the people who stay small from the people who build empires. I didn't spend it, and I didn't celebrate it, and I didn't tell anyone. I compounded it. I let it work, quietly, patiently, the way my grandmother had built her empire while the men assumed nothing was happening. By the third year, the small money was real money. By the fifth, it was a fund, and the fund had a name that wasn't mine, Halcyon, and a structure designed from the first day around invisibility, because I had learned at a closing gate exactly what the world does to a visible woman with power, and I intended never to give the world the chance. And somewhere in those years, I met the only two people I would ever fully trust, and they're part of how I came back, so you should meet them too. The first was Thomas Kalin, who became my chief operating officer and the closest thing I have to a brother, the real kind, the chosen kind, the kind that's nothing like the brothers I was born to. Thomas was a brilliant analyst the established firms had overlooked for reasons that had nothing to do with his ability and everything to do with the fact that the established firms, like the Beaumonts, could not imagine talent in a package they hadn't been taught to expect. I could imagine it, because I was that talent in that package, and I had learned to recognize my own kind, the overlooked and underestimated, and quietly furious with good reason. I hired Thomas when no one else would, and he has been loyal to me for 8 years, not out of gratitude, but out of the deep solidarity of two people who were both told they didn't count and decided to count anyway. Thomas knows everything Halcyon is. He helped me build the structure that bought the Ellington Group out from under the family that threw me away. And when I finally told him, years into our partnership, who I actually was and where I'd come from, he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "So when you came back for them, you wanted me to help you do it the right way, not burn it down. Take it back and build it better, and make the point with results instead of ashes." And I said yes. And he said, "Good. Ashes are easy. Building is the actual revenge. Let's build." That's Thomas. He's the reason the cold never tips into cruelty, because he's the one person who'll tell me when I'm reaching for the hot thing, and I listen. The second person was Gabriel Kent, and Gabriel is more complicated because Gabriel is the one person in 10 years who saw me whole, without knowing who I was, and loved what he saw before he had any idea it came with an empire. I met Gabriel in the 4th year, when Halcyon was still small, and so was he. He was building his own thing, a self-made man from nothing the way I was a self-made woman from less than nothing, and we crossed paths the way two people climbing the same mountain from different sides eventually do. He didn't know I was a Ellington. Almost no one did. He didn't know I was the strategist. No one did yet. He just knew me as Claire, a sharp, quiet, fiercely capable woman building something interesting. And he treated me from the first conversation as an equal, which I want you to understand was a more radical act than any romance, because I had reached the age of 22, having never once been treated as an equal by anyone except my dead grandmother. The men of my family had treated me as a problem. The world of finance treated me as an anomaly to be doubted. And Gabriel Kent looked at me across a negotiating table where we were, technically, on opposite sides of a deal, and he simply assumed, without a flicker of doubt, that I was the smartest person in the room, and adjusted his strategy accordingly, and lost the deal to me, and laughed about it, and asked me to dinner. "You beat me fairly and completely," he said over that first dinner, "and you did it so quietly I didn't realize I'd lost until it was over. I've never met anyone who does it quiet like that. Where did you learn to be quiet?" And I told him, carefully, a version of the truth, that I'd learned it from my grandmother, who'd built something and watched men take the credit. And Gabriel listened to the whole thing with an attention I wasn't used to, and at the end he said, "Then I hope, whatever you're building, you let yourself take the credit someday. The world should know your name." And I said, "The world will never know my name. That's the whole point." And Gabriel looked at me for a long moment and said, "Then I'll know it. Someone should." And that, over years, slowly, carefully, on the equal terms that were the only terms I could accept, became the one relationship in my adult life that wasn't a transaction. Gabriel Kent built his own empire alongside mine, never competing with me again after that first deal, always beside me, never once needing me to be smaller or softer or less than exactly what I was. And when I finally told him, years in, the whole truth, the Beaumonts, the gate, the plan to come home and take back what was stolen, he didn't try to talk me out of it, and he didn't try to make it his. He just said, "Do you want me there when you walk into that boardroom? Not to help. You don't need help. just so that when you sit in your grandmother's chair, there's one person in the building who's known the whole time exactly how much it cost you to build the right to sit there. And I said no, that I had to walk into that room alone, because I'd been thrown out of it alone. But I said, after, when it's done. I'd like you there after. And he said, I'll be there after. I've been there after for years, Claire. That's the whole job, and it's the only job I've ever wanted. So that's who came back. Not a girl with a suitcase nursing a 10-year grudge. A woman who'd built one of the largest fortunes in the world, with a chosen brother who'd help her do it right instead of cruel, and a partner who'd known her worth before it came with an empire, returning not to destroy the people who'd thrown her away, but to reclaim the thing they'd stolen and prove, with results instead of ashes, exactly what they'd discarded. But reclaiming it would not be as clean as sitting in a chair, because the Ellington Group was dying for real, and a dying company in a market full of predators draws exactly the kind of attention that turns a homecoming into a war. And the war arrived, as wars do, in the form of a man who'd been circling the Ellington carcass for months before I sat down in my father's chair. A man who'd assumed the dying dynasty would be easy prey, and who was about to learn that the prey now had an owner. Thomas brought me the file on my second day in the chairman's office, the office I'd had cleared of my father's things and was slowly, deliberately, filling with my grandmother's. The photographs of Lillian the family had taken down and hidden, the ones I'd had found and restored to the walls, so that the woman who actually built the company looked down once more on the room where its decisions were made. Thomas set the file on my desk and said, "We have a problem, and it's the kind of problem that was always going to come, because a wounded company in open water draws sharks, and this one's circled close." "Tell me," I said, looking up at my grandmother's photograph. "Frederick Royce," Thomas said, "the corporate raider. He's been quietly accumulating a position in the Ellington distressed debt for months, since before you moved, betting the family would collapse and he could seize the assets in the bankruptcy and strip them. He's good, Claire. Cold, patient, completely ruthless, no lines he won't cross. And he's just realized that someone else got to the company first, that the bankruptcy he was betting on isn't going to happen because a majority owner appeared from nowhere and is mounting a rescue. Which means his entire position is now threatened, and a cornered raider with a threatened position is the most dangerous animal in the market." Thomas's face was grave. "He's going to come at you, Claire, probably through the family, the disgruntled 49%, the relatives you just humiliated, who'd love nothing more than an ally with capital who promises to take the company back from you. Royce will offer them exactly that. And then it's a war for control, the strategist against the raider, with the wreckage of your family caught in the middle, and 40,000 jobs on the line, and 100 years of your grandmother's work hanging on whether you can outmaneuver the most dangerous predator in the market in the first month of taking back a company you've owned for 2 days. I looked at the file, at the name Frederick Royce, at the shape of the war that had been waiting for me beneath the homecoming, and I felt the cold come down. The clean, total cold my grandmother had taught me, the quiet that simply is. "Good," I said. "Let him come at me through the family. Let him offer the discarded relatives their revenge. Because there's something Frederick Royce doesn't understand yet. The thing nobody who comes at me ever understands until it's far too late." I turned my grandmother's photograph slightly toward me. "He thinks he's hunting a wounded company and a woman who just got here. He doesn't know he's hunting the strategist, who built 30 of these and has never lost one. On the ground she was born to fight on, with 100 years of her grandmother's empire underneath her and nothing left to prove to anyone." I closed the file. "Set the meeting with Royce. I want to look at the shark before I take him apart. And Thomas." I allowed myself the smallest cold smile, my grandmother's smile, the one from the photograph on the wall. "Call Gabriel. Tell him the war started early. Tell him I might need that after sooner than either of us thought." Frederick Royce did exactly what Thomas predicted, which is the first thing I appreciated about him, because a predictable enemy is a defeated enemy. And Frederick Royce was predictable in the specific way that very intelligent, ruthless people are predictable. He always reached for the most ruthless option, which meant I always knew where he'd be. Within a week of my taking the chair, Royce had made contact with the family's disgruntled 49%, and the family, being exactly what I'd always known them to be, took his call. I knew because I'd had Thomas watching, and because the family's betrayal of itself had a financial signature as clear as a confession. Leo, stripped of his chairmanship, humiliated in front of the board by the sister he'd helped throw out, was the easiest mark Frederick Royce had ever recruited. Vivian, exposed as either complicit in or negligent of Julian's embezzlement, facing the unraveling of everything she'd spent 15 years building, was looking for any lever that might pry the company back out of my hands. And Royce offered them exactly the lever they wanted: capital, expertise, and a promise that if they sided with him, helped him gather enough leverage to challenge my control, he would restore the family to power once I was removed. It was a lie, of course. I knew it was a lie because I knew what Frederick Royce was, and Frederick Royce had no intention of restoring anyone to anything. His plan, the moment he'd assembled enough leverage with the family's help, was to seize the company and strip it, exactly as he'd always intended. And the family who'd helped him would be discarded the instant they'd served their purpose, the way men like Royce always discard the useful fools who let them in the door. My family was about to do to themselves, through Royce, a more thorough version of what they'd done to me, and they couldn't see it, because they were so consumed by the desire to take the company back from the daughter they'd discarded that they couldn't recognize they were handing it to a man who'd destroy it completely. I could have warned them. I want you to sit with the fact that I could have warned them, that I could have walked into a room with Leo and Vivian and said, "The man you're allying with is going to betray you. He's not going to restore you. He's going to strip you. Side with me instead, and at least the company survives." I could have done that. And I chose not to, and I want to be honest about why, because the why is the difference between cold and cruel, and I've spent my whole life walking that line. I didn't warn them because they wouldn't have believed me, and because they needed to learn, the way I'd learned at a gate, that the world does not arrange itself around your sense of entitlement, that allies chosen out of spite are not allies, that a person who throws away the loyal in favor of the flattering ends up with nothing. They had thrown away the one family member who was actually trying to save them, me, in favor of a stranger promising them their old power back, exactly as they'd thrown me away years before in favor of the sons who flattered their sense of how the world should work. I didn't warn them because the warning was inside the lesson, and the lesson was the only thing that might, eventually, make any of them into people worth saving. So I let them ally with the shark, and I prepared, quietly, to make sure that when the shark turned on them, as I knew he would, I was positioned to save the company even as the family who'd betrayed me learned what betrayal costs. I met Frederick Royce in person before any of this had fully played out, because I wanted to look at him, the way my grandmother taught me to always look at an opponent before engaging, to read what he actually was under the performance. We met in a neutral room, the way apex predators meet, two of the largest movers of capital in the market, and Frederick Royce looked at me across the table with the particular contempt of a man who has spent his life being the most dangerous person in every room and cannot quite believe he's being asked to take a woman seriously. "Ms. Ellington," he said, and he made the name sound like an indulgence. "Or do you prefer the strategist?" I'll admit, when I learned the mysterious Halcyon chairman was a woman who'd been thrown out of the very family whose company she'd bought, I found it almost too neat. A revenge story, sentimental, and sentiment, in my experience, is the most exploitable weakness there is, because a person operating on feeling makes predictable mistakes. He leaned back, comfortable, certain. "You bought this company to make a point to your family. That's understandable, even admirable in a small way. But it means you're not actually here to run a business. You're here to win a personal grudge. And a person fighting a personal grudge against a person fighting for pure profit like me loses every time, because I'll do whatever the numbers require, and you'll do whatever your wounded feelings require. And feelings are slower and dumber than numbers. So let me offer you a graceful exit. Sell me your position at a premium, walk away having made your point and a profit, and let a professional handle the unpleasant business of what happens to this company next. It's the rational move. I'm told you're rational, under the sentiment." I let him finish, because my grandmother taught me that you let an opponent fully reveal his assumptions before you correct them, since every assumption he states is a weakness he's handing you. And Frederick Royce had just handed me all of them, that I was sentimental, that I was here for revenge, that I'd make emotional mistakes, that I was, underneath, a wounded woman playing at business. It was the exact assumption my family had made, the exact assumption the whole world made about a woman with power, and I had spent 10 years learning to use it as a weapon. "Mr. Royce," I said, "you've made a series of assumptions, and I'm going to correct them, not because I expect it to change your strategy, but because I want you to remember, later, that I told you the truth and you chose not to hear it. You assume I'm sentimental. I'm not. I'm the least sentimental person you'll ever meet. Sentiment is a luxury that was beaten out of me at a closing gate when I was 18. You assume I'm here for revenge. I'm not. Revenge is hot and wasteful, and I don't do hot things. I'm here because this company was built by my grandmother, the one genuine builder in my family, and it belongs in the hands of someone who can run it, and that someone is me. And the fact that taking it also corrects a historical injustice is a pleasant side effect, not a motive. And you assume that because I'm a woman who was wronged, I'll make emotional mistakes." I leaned forward, and I let him see for the first time the cold all the way down, the cold my grandmother had taught me and 10 years had perfected. "Mr. Royce, I have built 30 companies larger than this one. I have never lost a contest for control, not once. And I have won them all by doing exactly what you think only you can do, following the numbers wherever they lead, without a flicker of feeling, except that I've been doing it longer and better and more quietly than you, while the entire market, including you, assumed I couldn't possibly be what I am because I'm a woman and I don't perform my power loudly. That assumption, the one you're making right now, the one my family made, the one the whole world makes, is not my weakness, Mr. Royce. It is my single greatest weapon. Because every opponent I've ever faced has underestimated me in exactly the way you're underestimating me right now, and every one of them has lost, and not one of them saw it coming, because they were all too busy being certain that a woman couldn't be the most dangerous person in the room. I stood, the meeting over on my terms. You've allied with my family, I know, I let you. You think they're your inside line to taking this company from me. They're not. They're the bait in a trap I set the day I sat down in that chair, and you walked into it the moment you took their call, because you assumed, like everyone always assumes, that a wronged woman would be too consumed by her grudge to anticipate the obvious move. I anticipated it 18 months ago. Your alliance with my family isn't your path to victory, Mr. Royce. It's the rope. And you've just tied it around your own neck, and you don't even know it yet, because you're still certain that you're the shark, and I'm the wounded prey. I walked to the door. I'm not the prey, Mr. Royce. I'm the ocean. And the thing about the ocean is that the shark only feels powerful right up until the moment the tide goes out, and he discovers he was never the most dangerous thing in the water. He was just the loudest. Goodbye. I'll see you across a restructuring table soon, where I'll show you, in numbers, since numbers are the only language you respect, exactly what a quiet woman who's never lost can do to a loud man who's certain he can't lose. I left Frederick Royce in that room, and I will admit, because I've promised you the whole truth, that I enjoyed it. The specific cold pleasure of telling a powerful man exactly how he was going to lose, and watching him fail to believe it because his certainty about what a woman could be wouldn't let him. It's the same pleasure my grandmother must have felt, in the rare moments she allowed herself, watching the men who took credit for her work fail to understand that she was the one who'd built it. It's not a hot pleasure. It's a cold one, clean and patient and certain. The pleasure of knowing the truth in a room full of people committed to not seeing it. Thomas was waiting when I got back. "How is he?" he asked. "Exactly what we thought," I said. "Brilliant, ruthless, and completely blinded by the assumption that I can't be what I am. He's allied with the family. He thinks they're his inside line, and he has no idea they're the bait." I sat down beneath my grandmother's photograph. He called me sentimental. He called me a wounded woman playing at business. He offered me a graceful exit. I almost smiled. Do you know, Thomas, in 10 years of building Halcyon, every single opponent who underestimated me because I'm a woman has lost, and every single one was certain, right up to the end, that they couldn't possibly lose to me. It never stops working. The bias is so deep they can't see past it even when I tell them to their faces exactly how it'll end. I turned to the war ahead, the family, the shark, the dying company, the 100 years of my grandmother's work. So let's let Frederick Royce keep believing he's the shark. Let's let my family keep believing they've found an ally who'll restore them. And let's prepare, quietly, the way she taught me, to be the tide that goes out, and show all of them at once, the family and the shark together, exactly what they threw away when they decided a girl couldn't inherit. Pull everything on Royce's position. I want to know the exact shape of the rope before I let him finish tying it. While the war with Royce played out in the language of capital, the war I cared about more was the quiet one, the one for the company's actual life. And it was fought not in conference rooms, but on factory floors, and in the offices of people whose names never make the news. And I want to show you one piece of it, because it's the piece where I stopped being the avenger and became the builder, which is the only version of this story that would have made my grandmother proud. In my second week as chairman, I did the thing no Ellington man had done in 30 years. I went to the factory. The flagship plant, the one my grandmother had built with her own hands 60 years before, the beating industrial heart of the whole empire. And I went without announcement, without an entourage, without the chairman's theater, and I walked the floor, and I talked to the people who actually made the things the company sold. Leo had run the company for a decade and visited that floor exactly twice, both times for photographs. I went to listen the way my grandmother used to, because she'd taught me that the truth of a company lives on the floor, among the people doing the work, and that any chairman who doesn't go to the floor is running a company he doesn't actually understand, no matter how many reports cross his desk. What I found on the floor was a betrayal I hadn't fully mapped yet, and a loyalty I hadn't expected, and between them, the whole story of what the men had done to my grandmother's company. The betrayal had a name: Malcolm Shaw, the plant's general manager, a man Leo had installed 3 years earlier, replacing the manager my grandmother had hired. And within an hour of walking the floor, listening to the workers, reading the thing under the numbers the way she'd taught me, I understood that Malcolm Shaw was quietly strangling the plant for his own benefit. He'd been cutting corners on maintenance and safety to hit the cost targets that earned his bonus, deferring repairs that would eventually cause catastrophic failures, running the equipment my grandmother had bought into the ground while reporting healthy numbers upward, the way a man hollows out a house and repaints the front. The workers knew. They always know. They'd been raising concerns for 3 years, through the channels, and the channels led to Malcolm Shaw, who buried every concern because addressing them would have cost him his bonus. And the workers had stopped raising concerns, because they'd learned that raising them got you noticed in the wrong way, and noticed in the wrong way got you fired. And so the plant was deteriorating in a silence enforced by fear, exactly the way the whole company had deteriorated in a silence enforced by Leo's habit of firing anyone who told him the truth. I found one woman on that floor, a line supervisor named Ingrid, who'd been at the plant for 25 years, who'd known my grandmother, who looked at me with the specific recognition of someone seeing a ghost, and who said, when I asked her the truth about the plant and promised her honestly that telling it would cost her nothing, "You stand like her, old Mrs. Ellington, the real one, not the men. She used to walk this floor and listen like you're doing. Nobody's listened in 30 years. And then Ingrid told me everything, the deferred maintenance, the buried safety concerns, the equipment running on borrowed time, the fear that kept it all silent. 3 years of a plant being hollowed out by a manager protecting his bonus while the workers watched and couldn't speak. She told me with the careful courage of a person who's been punished for honesty before and is risking it one more time. And when she finished, she said, "If I'm fired for telling you this, so be it. Somebody should have said it years ago. Old Mrs. Ellington would have wanted somebody to say it." I did not fire Ingrid. I promoted her. I want you to understand the move because it's the builder's move, the one the strippers never make. The obvious thing, the cold revenge thing, would have been to focus on the war with Royce, on the family, on the dramatic reckonings. Instead, I spent my second week on a factory floor, and I found Malcolm Shaw, and I dealt with him the way you deal with a man who endangers workers' lives to protect his bonus. I removed him, immediately, completely, with the documentation to ensure he never managed people anywhere again. Because a man who defers safety repairs to hit cost targets isn't a business problem. He's a danger to human beings. And there's no rehabilitation role for that, the way there was no rehabilitation for Julian's theft. And then I did the thing that mattered more than removing him. I found the manager my grandmother had hired, the one Leo had fired, the one who'd actually known how to run the plant, and I brought her back, and I put Ingrid and the line workers who'd been silenced into a real safety council with real authority. and I funded every deferred repair, and I told the entire plant, gathered on the floor, the truth. For 3 years, you've been punished for telling the truth about this plant. That's over. The truth is the most valuable thing a company has, and any manager who silences it to protect his bonus is stealing something worse than money. He's stealing the company's ability to know itself. From now on, the people on this floor are the people I trust most to tell me what's real, because you're the ones who actually make the thing, and the thing either works or it doesn't, and you're the ones who know. My grandmother built this plant by listening to the floor. The men who came after stopped listening, and the plant nearly died of the silence. I'm listening again. Tell me the truth, all of it, always, and I will protect you for it instead of punishing you for it. Because that's how she ran it, and that's how it's going to be run again. The plant transformed within a month, not because of capital, though I funded it, but because of the silence ending. It turns out that 3 years of suppressed knowledge released is the most valuable asset a company can recover, and the workers who'd been silenced became, once they believed the listening was real, the most powerful engine of the turnaround I had. They knew everything that was wrong because they'd been watching it go wrong while forbidden to speak. And the moment I made the speaking safe, the knowledge poured out. And with the knowledge came the fixes. And the plant that had been hollowed out under Malcolm Shaw became, within months, the healthiest operation in the company. The proof of concept for the whole turnaround. Run on the radical principle that the people doing the work know the truth, and a wise chairman listens. Thomas, when I told him about the plant, said, "You know, you could have won the whole war from the boardroom. Royce, the family, the shares, all of it. You didn't need to spend your second week on a factory floor talking to a line supervisor named Ingrid. Why did you?" "Because the boardroom war is about ownership," I said, "and ownership is just the right to make decisions. It's the floor that decides whether the decisions are any good." My grandmother knew that. She built an empire by walking floors and listening to Greta's, and the men who inherited it stopped walking the floors and started believing the reports. And the reports lied to them because the reports came up through men like Malcolm Shaw, who had every reason to lie. And the whole empire rotted from the floor up, in a silence the men at the top never heard because they never went down to listen. I looked at my grandmother's photograph. The reason girls don't inherit is the same reason the company died, Thomas. It's the belief that the truth comes from the top, from the men with the names and the chairs and the reports, and that the people below, the women, the workers, the Gretas, the granddaughters trained in locked studies, don't have anything worth hearing. It's all the same disease. The men at the top who couldn't imagine a girl could inherit also couldn't imagine a line supervisor could know more about the plant than the general manager. And both failures of imagination came from the same place, the belief that worth lives at the top and flows down, when the truth is the opposite. Worth lives everywhere, especially in the places the powerful have trained themselves not to look. I turned from the photograph. So I went to the floor, because the floor is where the truth was, and because my grandmother taught me that the chairman who listens to the floor beats the chairman who listens to the reports every single time, and because saving this company was never going to happen in a boardroom. It was going to happen on factory floors, in the released knowledge of silenced workers, in the promotion of a Ingrid who'd been punished for honesty for 25 years. That's the turnaround. The boardroom war just secured the right to do it. The floor is where it actually got done. And that's the piece of the story I most want you to remember, more than the boardroom, more than Royce, more than the family reckonings, because it's the piece that was hers, the builder's piece, the listening. The men of my family thought running an empire meant sitting at the top and being obeyed. My grandmother knew it meant walking the floor and listening to the truth, especially from the people the top was trained not to hear. I learned it in a locked study and confirmed it in a year at the bottom of the world, and I practiced it the moment I took the chair, on a factory floor, with a line supervisor named Ingrid, who stood like she remembered the only other person who'd ever listened. The cold won the war, the listening saved the company, and the listening, the floor, the Gretas, the truth flowing up instead of lies flowing down, that was my grandmother's real method, the one the gala speeches never mention, the one that built the empire and the one that, 3 generations later, brought it back from death, in the hands of the granddaughters she trained to listen. While Frederick Royce assembled his leverage with my family's eager help, certain he was building toward a challenge to my control, I did two things at once. And the doing of both at once is the part I'm proudest of, because it's the part that separates a builder from a destroyer. And my grandmother was a builder, and so am I. The first thing I did was set the trap, and I'll explain the mechanics, because the elegance matters. Royce's plan depended on the family's 49%. With my 51, I had control. But control is not the same as immunity. There were certain decisions under the bylaws that required a supermajority, and there were legal challenges the minority could mount to slow and harass and create the appearance of instability that might frighten the creditors and the regulators. Royce's strategy was to weaponize the family's 49% into a campaign of obstruction and challenge, to make the company appear ungovernable under my control, to create enough chaos that the creditors would lose confidence, the rescue would falter, and the company would slide toward the bankruptcy he'd been betting on all along, at which point he'd seize the assets cheap in the wreckage, discarding the family who'd helped him the moment they'd served their purpose. It was a good plan. It depended entirely on the family's 49% staying allied to Royce. So I made sure it wouldn't. I didn't do it by warning them, because they wouldn't have believed me. I did it by letting Royce be exactly what he was, and arranging for the family to see it, at the moment of maximum impact, with their own eyes, in his own words. Because here is the thing about a man with no lines. He can't help reaching for the most ruthless option. And a man who always reaches for the most ruthless option can always be maneuvered into revealing his ruthlessness, if you simply create the conditions where his nature has to show itself. I had Thomas, through channels Royce couldn't trace, feed Royce's operation a piece of information designed to make him believe the family's usefulness was nearly at an end, that the decisive move was close, and that the time had come to start planning the family's disposal. And Royce, being exactly what he was, took the bait, and began, in communications he believed were secure, to arrange the betrayal of the very family he was using, the stripping of the assets, the discarding of Leo and Vivian once they'd delivered the leverage. He documented his own treachery in his own words because his nature required him to, because a man who always reaches for the most ruthless option will always, eventually, put the ruthlessness in writing. And then, at the right moment, I made sure the family saw it. I did it cleanly, legally, in a way that couldn't be traced to manipulation. In the course of legitimate due diligence on Royce's position, certain communications came to light, and those communications made their way, through proper channels, to the family's lawyers. Leo and Vivian, who had allied with Frederick Royce, certain he would restore them to power, read, in his own words, his plan to use them, strip the company, and discard them with nothing. They read their own betrayal, written by the man they'd betrayed me to ally with. And the alliance that Royce's entire strategy depended on shattered in a single afternoon. Because there is no loyalty among people who chose each other out of spite and greed. And the moment the family understood that Royce intended to destroy them too, his 49% evaporated, and his whole campaign of obstruction lost its foundation. I want to be clear about what I'd done, because it's the cold thing, the precise thing, the thing my grandmother would have recognized. I didn't save my family. I didn't warn them out of loyalty or affection. I simply arranged the board so that Frederick Royce's own nature destroyed his own alliance, the way Royce's nature destroyed everything it touched. And the family's salvation from his betrayal was a side effect of the trap, not its purpose. I let my enemies' natures do my work, the way my grandmother taught me, the way I'd done my whole career. Royce's ruthlessness destroyed Royce's alliance. The family's greed had walked them into a betrayal that only my trap saved them from. And I kept my hands clean, and my company protected, and my grandmother's empire safe. And the only thing anyone could ever point to was a woman exercising legitimate due diligence in defense of a company she owned. That was the trap. But the trap was only half of what I did. And the other half is the half that mattered more. The half that was about the company and not the war. Because a war for control is meaningless if the thing you're fighting for dies in the fighting. While Royce assembled his doomed leverage, I saved the Ellington Group. Not its ownership, its actual life. The 40,000 jobs, the operations, the real industrial work that my grandmother had built and the men had nearly killed. And I did it the way she would have, by undoing the rot, one piece at a time, with the cold, patient competence that the men of my family had never possessed. I reversed Leo's vanity acquisitions, selling the overpriced trophies he'd bought to look like a visionary, recovering cash the company desperately needed. I found the loyal executives Leo had fired, the ones my grandmother had hired, the ones who actually understood the operations, and I brought them back, every one. Because an empire runs on the people who know how it actually works, not the flatterers who tell the chairman what he wants to hear. I restructured the strangling debt, using Halcyon's resources and credibility to refinance on terms the family could never have secured, because the creditors who wouldn't extend $1 to Leo's Ellington Group extended every confidence to the strategists. And I walked the factory floors, the way my grandmother used to, the way no Ellington man had done in 30 years. And I listened to the people who actually made the things the company sold. And I learned in a month more about the real health of the business than Leo had learned in a decade of running it from a boardroom, because Leo had never once believed that the truth might be found among the people doing the work. Within 2 months, the Ellington Group was not dying anymore. It wasn't healthy yet. Healing takes longer than killing, but the slide had stopped, the cash had stabilized, the loyal people were back, the rot was being cut out, and the creditors who'd been preparing for a bankruptcy were now watching, with cautious astonishment, a wounded dynasty begin, under its new chairman, to actually recover. And the recovery did something Royce's strategy could never survive. It removed the bankruptcy he'd been betting on. There was no wreckage coming for him to seize, because the woman he'd dismissed as a sentimental wounded grudge holder had quietly, competently, saved the company he'd assumed would fall into his hands. Thomas, watching the turnaround take hold, said, "You know what the most satisfying part is? It's not the trap. It's not even beating Royce. It's that you're proving the thing that the gate was built on, that a girl couldn't run this, was a lie. And you're proving it not with a speech, but with results, the company actually recovering under the daughter they threw out. Royce thinks the war is about control. It's not. You already have control. The war is about the lie. The girls don't inherit lie, and you're winning it the only way it can really be won, by simply, undeniably, being better at the thing they said you couldn't do than every man who was given the chance instead of you." My grandmother used to say something, I told him, looking at her photograph on the wall, the woman who'd built it all and been erased. She said the men will always have the speeches, and the speeches will always credit the men. But the factory either runs or it doesn't, and the factory doesn't care about your speeches. It only cares whether you actually know how to make it run. The men of my family had the speeches and the name and the chairman's chair, and they couldn't make the factory run. I have no speeches, and I was thrown out of the name, and the factory runs again the month I touch it. I turned from the photograph. That's the answer to girls don't inherit, Thomas. Not revenge, not a speech, a running factory, 40,000 people with their jobs secure, a 100-year empire pulled back from death by the granddaughter who actually understood it. That's the thing my grandmother died trying to make possible, and it's the thing I came back to finish, and Frederick Royce and my whole family put together can't stop it, because you can't argue with a factory that runs. The numbers are the argument. They always were. The men just never understood that the numbers don't care who you are. They only care whether you're right. I looked at the war ahead, the family's shattered alliance, Royce's doomed position, the recovering company. Royce's leverage is gone. His alliance is broken. His bankruptcy isn't coming. He's spent a fortune on a position that's now worth a fraction of what he paid against a company that's recovering under an owner who's never lost. So now we do the last thing. We take Frederick Royce apart completely the cold way, and we do it in front of my family, so that they understand finally the full size of what they discarded, and so that the lesson lands the way the truth always lands, in numbers, undeniable, with no speeches required. Set the restructuring meeting. It's time to show the shark the tide going out. Before Royce's alliance with the family fully collapsed, Vivian made one last move. And it was the move I'd been most prepared for, because it was the oldest move there is against a woman with power. She tried to make the story about my character instead of my competence. She did it through the press, the way these things are always done. A coordinated narrative planted in the financial and society media at once. And it was clever, I'll give Vivian that. because it used every gendered weapon the world keeps loaded for exactly this purpose. The story painted me as a cold, ungrateful interloper, a woman who'd abandoned her family for 10 years and then swooped in like a vulture the moment they were weak to seize the company for money and revenge. It questioned how I'd really made my fortune, the implication never stated, but always hovering that a woman who'd built that much that fast must have done something improper, must have had a man behind her, must have cut corners a man wouldn't be questioned about. It framed my coldness as evidence of a defective heart rather than disciplined competence. The same coldness that would be called strong leadership in a male chairman, recast as the chilling symptom of a woman who'd lost her femininity to ambition. And it told a tender counter-story about poor, aging Arthur and devoted Vivian and the golden son Leo, a loving family blindsided by the grasping daughter who'd come home to take everything. No mention of the gate, the suitcase, the buried will, the embezzlement, the 10 years. It was, I want to be clear, a good attack, because it bypassed the thing I was unbeatable at, the numbers, the competence, the running factory, and went straight for the thing the world is always primed to believe about a powerful woman, that her power is illegitimate, that her strength is coldness, that her success is suspicious, that underneath the competent exterior is a grasping, unnatural, unwomanly thing that the warm, normal family was right to expel. It didn't matter that it was false. The narrative didn't need to be true. It only needed to activate the thing the world already half believes, and then let the world do the rest. A weaker player would have fought it directly, issued denials, told her side, gotten into the mud of competing narratives, which is exactly where Vivian wanted me, because in the mud, the woman always loses, since the woman is fighting to prove she's not the thing the world is primed to believe, and you cannot win an argument that starts from the assumption of your guilt. So I didn't fight it directly. I did what my grandmother taught me, what I'd done to Royce, what I do to everything. I went still, and I went to the truth, and I let the attack's own nature destroy it. Because here is the flaw in Vivian's narrative, the flaw in every character attack on a competent woman. It depends on the absence of facts. It works in the space where the audience doesn't know what actually happened, where the grasping daughter story can fill the vacuum. And I had spent 18 months and a locked study and 10 years accumulating facts. So I didn't argue with the narrative. I simply quietly, completely released the facts and let them end the narrative the way sunlight ends a shadow. I released the will, the real one. My grandmother's full will, the buried letter naming me her chosen successor, the letter that predicted 15 years ago in her own hand, the exact catastrophe the men would cause, and named me the only one who could prevent it. I released it not with commentary, not with a victim's plea, just the document, the founder's own words, 15 years old, predicting everything that had happened and naming the daughter as the heir. And the grasping interloper narrative died the instant the world read it, because you cannot maintain that a woman swooped in like a vulture to steal a company when the company's revered founder named her the heir in writing 15 years before and predicted the men would destroy it and was right about every word. I released the record of why I'd left. Not a tearful account, just the facts. The contested will, the documented expulsion, the 18-year-old walk to the gate with a suitcase, the 10 years of no contact initiated entirely by the family. The grasping daughter who abandoned her family became, in the light of the facts, the disowned child who was thrown out and built a life and came back, which is a different story entirely, and a true one. And I let Vivian's own weapons turn in her hand. The narrative had questioned how I'd made my fortune, implied impropriety, implied a man behind me. So I let the facts of Halcyon speak, 10 years of documented, scrutinized, impeccable building, an empire so clean that the implication of impropriety, examined, evaporated, leaving only the uncomfortable truth the narrative had been constructed to avoid. That a woman had built one of the largest fortunes in the world entirely on her own competence, and that the only reason anyone found this suspicious was the thing the narrative was counting on, the world's inability to believe it, which, once named, became embarrassing to hold. I did not have to call myself a victim. I did not have to plead. I simply released the facts, in order, without commentary, and let the world watch Vivian's careful narrative dissolve in the light of a buried will, a documented expulsion, and a spotless 10-year record, until the story flipped entirely, and the press that had been primed to write about the grasping, cold daughter found itself writing instead about the founder's chosen heir who'd been thrown out for being a girl, buried for a decade, and had come home to save the company the men nearly destroyed, exactly as the founder predicted. Vivian's attack didn't just fail. It became the vehicle that spread my grandmother's truth wider than I ever could have alone, because the press that had been mobilized to destroy me was now mobilized by the facts to tell the real story. And a mobilized press telling the truth is the most powerful amplifier there is. Thomas watched the narrative flip in real time and said, "She handed you the megaphone. She built a whole press operation to destroy you, and you turned it into the thing that broadcast your grandmother's buried will to the entire country. How did you know that would work?" "Because a character attack on a competent woman has one fatal weakness," I said. "It depends on the audience not having the facts, because the facts are always on the woman's side, or she wouldn't have survived long enough to be worth attacking. The attack only works in the dark. So you don't fight it in the dark where it's strong, you turn on the lights. You release the facts, all of them, without emotion, without pleading, and you let the facts do what facts do to a narrative built on their absence. Vivian's story needed me to be voiceless or defensive or pleading, anything but factual, because the moment the facts were in the room, her story couldn't survive them. So I gave the room the facts and said nothing else, and her own attack became the thing that carried the truth, because she'd mobilized everyone to look. And then I made sure that what they saw when they looked was the truth instead of the lie. I looked at my grandmother's photograph. She faced versions of this her whole life, you know. Every time she got too visible, too clearly the real force behind the company, the men around her would let the whispers start. The questions about whether she really understood it, the implications, the narrative that a woman couldn't really be the genius. And she had no facts to release because the men controlled the record, the signatures, the official story. She had to stay invisible, precisely because the moment she became visible, the character attack came, and she had no way to win it, because the men held all the facts and she held none. That was her cage. The men didn't just take the credit, they held the facts, so they controlled the only weapon that could have cleared her. I straightened. I'm not in her cage. That's the difference between her time and mine, the one real difference. I hold the facts. I built my own empire, my own record, my own documentation, and I recovered her buried will. So when the character attack came, the oldest attack there is, I had the one thing she never had, the truth, in my own hands, ready to release. And that's why I won the thing she couldn't. Not because I'm stronger than her, I'm not. She built more from less than I ever will. Because I had the facts, and she was denied them. And the facts are the only thing that beats the narrative. And the deepest injustice done to the women before me wasn't that they were underestimated. It was that they were denied the facts that could have proven the estimate wrong. I made sure I'd never be denied the facts. And so the attack that would have destroyed her, undefended, factless, became for me just one more shadow that ended the moment I turned on the light. Vivian's narrative collapsed, and with it the last of her leverage, and the family's alliance with Royce shattered soon after, and the war moved toward its end. But I've lingered on the character attack because it's the most female part of this whole story, the part that has nothing to do with capital and everything to do with the specific weapon the world keeps loaded for women with power, the make-it-about-her-character weapon, the she's cold, she's grasping, she must have cheated weapon, the one my grandmother could never beat because she was denied the facts, and the one I beat the only way it can be beaten, by holding the facts and turning on the light. That's the inheritance too, the one I'd add to my grandmother's. Not just build in the shadows, but hold your own facts, always. Document your own truth, so that when they come for your character, as they always come for a powerful woman's character, you have the one thing that ends the attack, the truth in your own hands, ready, undismissible, waiting only for you to turn on the light. I took Frederick Royce apart in a conference room full of lawyers and bankers, and I did it the way my grandmother would have, without raising my voice, in the language of numbers, so completely and so quietly that it took him several minutes to understand he'd already lost. By the time we sat down across that table, Royce's position was a catastrophe, though only I fully understood the dimensions of it yet. His alliance with my family was shattered, His obstruction campaign had collapsed, and the bankruptcy he'd bet everything on was not coming, because the company was recovering. He held a large position in the Ellington distressed debt that he'd accumulated betting on a death that wasn't going to happen. Debt that was now appreciating as the company healed, which sounds like good news for a debt holder until you understand the trap inside it, which Royce was about to. "Mr. Royce," I said, "you hold a substantial position in the Ellington Group's debt, acquired when the company was dying, at distressed prices, on the assumption that it would enter bankruptcy and you'd seize the assets. The company is not entering bankruptcy, it's recovering, which means your debt is now performing, and you have a choice. You can hold it, in which case you're a passive creditor in a company controlled by me, earning a modest return on a position you bought for a different and now impossible purpose. Your capital trapped, your strategy dead, your fortune locked in a recovery you have no part in directing. Or you can sell. And here is the part you haven't fully calculated yet." I slid the first document across the table. "The only buyer at the scale required to take your position is Halcyon. Me. Other buyers exist, but not at your size, not quickly. And you need to exit quickly because you're leveraged, Mr. Royce. You borrowed to build this position, betting on a fast bankruptcy and a fast strip, and now the bankruptcy isn't coming, and the leverage is a clock, and the clock is running. And the only buyer who can take you out before the clock runs out is the person across this table. So you can hold a dead position while your leverage strangles you, or you can sell to me at the price I name, which will be a price that reflects exactly how little leverage you have left, which is none." I watched Frederick Royce understand it, the same way I'd watched my family understand it in the boardroom. The slow horror of a person discovering that every exit has been closed in advance. He'd come to hunt a wounded company. He'd assembled a leveraged position betting on its death. He'd allied with a family I'd turned into a trap. And now the company was recovering. His alliance was gone. His leverage was a noose. And the only person who could buy him out of the catastrophe was the woman he'd dismissed as a sentimental grudge holder, who could now name any price she liked, because she was the only ocean deep enough to hold a drowning shark. "You planned this," Royce said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard there before, the dawning respect of one cold mind for another. "From the moment you sat down in that chair, you let me ally with the family, you let me build the position, you let me leverage myself into a corner, betting on a bankruptcy you intended to prevent the whole time. You weren't defending against my attack, you were the trap my attack walked into." "Yes," I said, "though I'd correct one thing. I didn't let you do anything. You did it all yourself, because your nature required it. You're a man who always reaches for the most ruthless option. And a man who always reaches for the most ruthless option is the easiest man in the world to defeat, because you never have to outthink him. You only have to know him, and then arrange the board so that his own ruthlessness carries him into the corner his nature was always going to choose. You bet on the company's death because betting on death is what you do. You allied with my bitter family because exploiting the bitter and the greedy is what you do. You leveraged yourself to seize the maximum because seizing the maximum is what you do. Every move that destroyed you was a move your own nature required. And all I did was understand your nature more clearly than you understand it yourself, and then wait. I named the price. It was low. It was insultingly, surgically low. The price of a man with no leverage and a running clock. And I named it without a flicker, the way my grandmother named prices to the men who'd once tried to squeeze her. That's my offer. It expires when I leave this room. After that, you can hold your dead position and let your leverage strangle you. And I'll buy it from your creditors in 6 months for even less when the clock finishes running. Your choice, Mr. Royce. But choose now, because unlike you, I don't make threats. I make offers, once, at the price the numbers support. And the numbers don't support you at all. Frederick Royce sat across that table, the most feared corporate raider in the market, taken apart not by a louder predator, but by a quiet woman who'd understood him better than he understood himself. And he did the only rational thing a rational, ruthless man can do when the board has been closed against him. He took the offer. He sold me his position at the insulting price, took the largest loss of his career, and got out before the clock finished him entirely. Because a man with no lines is also a man with no loyalty to his own pride. And Royce, whatever else he was, could read a board once someone forced him to see all of it. And then he did something I didn't expect. He sat for a moment after signing, and he looked at me and he said, "I've spent my career being the most dangerous person in every room, and I built that career on a simple edge. Everyone shows you what they are eventually, if you're patient and ruthless enough to wait for it. I never once considered that there might be a player who'd let me show her everything I am while showing me nothing of what she is, who'd let me build my whole strategy on an assumption about her that she'd cultivated specifically so I'd build my strategy on it." He shook his head slowly. "The whole market underestimates you because you're a woman. You've turned that into the most powerful weapon I've ever seen, because the underestimation isn't a thing you fight, it's a thing you feed. And every opponent walks into it certain they can't lose to you, and by the time they understand, the board's already closed. That's not a grudge. That's not sentiment. That's the coldest strategic mind I've encountered in 30 years. And I'm almost glad I lost to it, because at least now I understand why I never saw you coming. Nobody sees you coming. You've built your entire power on not being seen as power. It's brilliant. It's the most brilliant thing I've ever lost to." He stood. "Run your grandmother's company well, Ms. Ellington. God knows you've earned it more thoroughly than anyone I've ever watched earn anything. And do me one favor. When the rest of the market finally figures out what you are, the way I just did, remember that I was the one who told you the underestimation was your weapon, and not the wound everyone assumes it is. You knew it already, but I'd like to have been the one who said it out loud." And Frederick Royce left, the largest loss of his career behind him, a strange professional respect in the place where his contempt had been. And I let him go, because destroying Frederick Royce had never been the point. Protecting my grandmother's company was the point. And the company was protected now. The shark bought out. The family's betrayal collapsed. The recovery taking hold. The 100 years of Lillian Hawthorne's work safe at last in the hands of the granddaughter she'd trained to save it. My family had watched the whole thing. I'd made sure of it. The restructuring meeting was attended by representatives of the 49%, which meant Leo and Vivian's lawyers, which meant the family learned in real time that the daughter they'd thrown out had not only seized their company, but had then, in the space of 2 months, saved it from death, broken the alliance they'd betrayed her to join, and taken apart the most feared raider in the market without raising her voice. They learned that the woman they'd told, at a gate, that girls don't inherit, was the most formidable industrialist any of them had ever encountered, and that everything they'd believed about her, about themselves, about how the world was supposed to work, had been wrong from the foundation. Thomas found me afterward in the chairman's office, beneath my grandmother's restored photograph. "It's done," he said. "Royce is gone. The company's recovering. The family's broken. You've won, Claire, completely. The way you wanted, with results instead of ashes. So why do you look like the war isn't over?" I looked up at Lillian Hawthorne's photograph, the woman who'd built it all and been erased, who died trying to put the empire into the hands of the one descendant who could save it. And I thought about the part of this that wasn't business, the part that no trap and no turnaround and no defeated shark could resolve, the part that was waiting for me still. "Because it's not over," I said. "The business war is over. I've won that completely, the way she taught me. But there's a thing underneath the business that I haven't dealt with yet, and it's the thing I actually came home for, under the company and the revenge and the proving them wrong." I turned from the photograph. "My father is dying, Thomas. Really dying, not the ordinary aging the doctors give him months. And before he dies, there's a truth in this family that's never been spoken, a truth about why I was really thrown out, a truth about my grandmother's will and what my father actually did, that I've suspected for 10 years and never confirmed. And I came home not just to take the company, but to finally have that conversation, the one that's been waiting at the bottom of all of this since a gate closed when I was 18. I straightened my grandmother's photograph on the wall. The shark was easy. The family was easy. They were just business. But the truth about my father, and what he did to my grandmother's last wish, and whether there's anything left in him worth the conversation, that's the hard part. That's the part that isn't cold, the part the cold can't solve, the part I've been putting off by fighting wars I knew I'd win. And it's time. Get me a meeting with my father. Alone. No lawyers, no company, just the daughter he threw out and the man who threw her, and the truth that's been waiting 10 years to finally be said out loud. There is a thing that happens to a powerful woman who has spent her life invisible when the world finally begins to sense her, and I want to tell you how I handled it, because the handling is the whole philosophy, and because somewhere in it, I made a choice about the next generation that matters more to me than any war I won. After Royce, the market began to sense the strategist. Not to know me, not yet. The structure was too deep for that. But to sense that something at the scale of the Ellington rescue executed that cleanly against a raider that feared implied a player far larger than a returning heiress running a single recovered company. The smart money began to wonder. There were quiet inquiries, careful probes, the financial world's instinct that a new apex predator had revealed an edge of itself and gone still again. And I faced, for the first time, the choice my grandmother never got to face, because the world of her time would never have let her. The choice to step into the light, to let the world know what I was, to be celebrated as the colossus I'd built, to take, finally, the credit she was denied. It was a real temptation, and a specifically female one, and I want to name it honestly. Because my grandmother had been erased, and I had been thrown out, and there is a deep and righteous hunger in a woman who has been told she doesn't count to finally, fully count out loud. To make the world that dismissed her acknowledge her, to stand in the light and say, I built this, I am this, see me. The hunger is just. The world earned it. And for a few weeks after Royce, I felt it pulling at me. The desire to let the strategist be known, to make every man who'd ever underestimated me, the family, Royce, the whole dismissive market, see the full scale of what a woman they'd written off had built. And I chose the shadows. Again. The way she would have, if she'd had the choice, and the way I had to, because the calculation hadn't changed. The visibility is a trap, I told Thomas when he asked, the way Royce had once asked me why I'd stay hidden when I could be a legend. It's the same trap for a woman that it was for my grandmother, just dressed up as progress. They'll tell me the world is different now, that a woman can be a known titan, that I've earned the right to the light. And it's partly true. But here's what doesn't change. The moment I'm visible, I'm a target. And not just the ordinary target every visible fortune becomes. A visible, powerful woman is a target in a way a visible, powerful man never is, because the world that can't quite accept her will spend all its energy looking for the reason she doesn't deserve it. The scandal, the flaw, the man who must really be behind her, the proof that she got lucky or cheated or slept her way up. A visible, powerful man is assumed competent until proven otherwise. A visible, powerful woman is assumed fraudulent until proven over and over, forever, exhaustingly, and even then, doubted. So visibility for me isn't the reward it looks like. It's a tax, a permanent tax of having to prove every single day in public the competence that a man would be granted for free. And I refuse to pay it. Not because I couldn't, but because the energy it would cost me to defend my visibility is energy I'd rather spend building, the way she spent hers building in the shadows, where no one made her prove she deserved to be there because no one knew she was there. I looked at my grandmother's photograph. The invisibility isn't my prison, Thomas. It's my freedom. It's the one place the tax doesn't reach. She understood that in a world that gave her no choice. I understand it. In a world that pretends to give me a choice but would make me pay the tax the moment I chose the light. So I stay in the shadows, and I keep my power, and I spend none of my energy defending my right to it, because in the shadows, there's no one to defend it to. That's not hiding. That's the most strategic use of invisibility there is, and it's the inheritance she left me along with everything else. The knowledge that for a woman, the quiet is not where you're hidden, it's where you're free. I dissolved the structures that had grown too exposed, the way my grandmother would have, and the strategist sank back into the shadows, the market's brief sense of her fading into one more unconfirmed rumor about an unseen player, and I went back to being free. But I did one thing with the near visibility before I let it fade, and it's the thing I'm proudest of in this entire story, more than the boardroom, more than Royce, more than correcting my grandmother's history. I found the next one. Her name was Chloe, and she was a junior analyst at the Ellington Group, 23 years old, brilliant in the specific way I'd been brilliant at 23, and overlooked in the specific way I'd been overlooked. and underestimated by everyone around her for the specific reasons women are underestimated. And I noticed her the way my grandmother had noticed me, because I'd learned to recognize my own kind, the overlooked and the quietly furious, and the ones who see the thing and not the shadow. Chloe had flagged a problem in a deal everyone else had approved, quietly, in a memo no one read. And she'd been right. And no one had noticed she'd been right. And she'd watched the deal go through anyway and said nothing more because she'd learned already at 23 that being right as a junior woman gets you nothing but the exhausting knowledge that you were right. I read her memo. I saw the things she'd seen. And I did, for Chloe, what my grandmother had done for me in a locked study. I started teaching her. Not formally, not publicly, nothing that would put the tax on her before she was ready to refuse it. Quietly, the way it has to be done, the way it's always had to be done, woman to woman, in the shadows. The knowing passed down where the men who dismiss it can't see it happening. I taught Chloe to see the thing and not the shadow, the way Lillian taught me. I gave her real problems and corrected her the way my grandmother corrected me, as a colleague who was temporarily wrong, not a junior who was permanently lesser. And I watched her grow, fast, the way I'd grown, because the only thing she'd ever lacked was someone who'd refused to underestimate her, the single rarest resource in the world for a woman with her mind. And I'd become, for Chloe, the thing my grandmother had been for me, the one person who saw her clearly and bet on her. "Why her?" Thomas asked, watching me invest hours in a junior analyst when I had an empire to run. "You've got 40,000 employees. Why pour yourself into one 23-year-old? "Because someone poured herself into me," I said. "In a locked study, when I was 8, because she was lonely and erased, and she found a child who could see her, and she bet everything on me, against all the men and all the doctrine, and she was right. And she died hoping the knowing would survive her, that the thing she'd built in my head would carry through whatever came. It did. I'm sitting in her chair because a lonely genius in a locked study refused to let her knowing die with her, and passed it to a girl the world would underestimate. And the girl carried it through the gate and the terror and the 10 years, and brought it home." I looked at Chloe across the office, bent over a problem, seeing the thing. "That's not a thing you keep, Thomas. It's a thing you pass. My grandmother passed it to me. The chain is the whole point. Every generation, a woman who built in the shadows finds a girl the world overlooked and pours the knowing into her, and bets on her against all the certainty that girls don't inherit. And the knowing survives, and grows, and comes back, and takes what was stolen, one generation at a time, in the quiet, where they can't see it happening. I'm one link. Chloe's the next. And someday Chloe will be in a chair somewhere with an empire of her own. And she'll notice a 23-year-old that everyone else overlooks. And she'll start teaching her, in the shadows, the way it's always been done, the way it has to be done. And the chain will go on, longer than any of us, longer than any empire, the knowing passed woman to woman, undismissible because it's never visible, unstoppable because it's never loud." I turned back to my grandmother's photograph. That's her real legacy, not the company, the chain. The locked study, repeated across generations, each woman finding the next and refusing to let the world's underestimation be the last word. The company is just where this generation's link happens to sit. The chain is the actual inheritance, the one that can't be buried, the one my father couldn't reach when he buried the will, because you can't bury a thing that lives in the next woman's head. Girls don't inherit, they said, but the knowing inherits, woman to woman, forever. And the knowing is the only thing that was ever worth having, and it's the one thing they could never, ever take, because they never even knew it was being passed. Chloe runs a division now. She earned it, fast, on the merits, the way I climbed, and she's extraordinary. And the day will come when she's somewhere with an empire of her own, finding the next link, and I will have been, for her, what Lillian was for me, and the chain will go on. That's the part of this story that isn't revenge and isn't even reclaiming. It's the part that's just the chain, the knowing passed in the quiet, the one inheritance that survives every gate and every buried will and every man certain that girls don't inherit. We don't inherit. We pass the knowing, woman to woman, in locked studies and quiet offices where they can't see, And the knowing builds and reclaims and corrects the history and finds the next girl forever. And there is no gate in the world that can close on a thing that was never in the house to begin with, because it was always, only, in our heads, where they never thought to look, where the real inheritance has always quietly lived. My father agreed to see me, which surprised me, and he agreed to see me alone, which surprised me more. And when I walked into his study, the study I'd been forbidden from as a child because business was not for girls, I found an old, ill, diminished man waiting for me in a chair by the window. And for a moment, before the cold reasserted itself, I felt the strange vertigo of seeing the giant of my childhood reduced to a frightened old man dying by a window. "You came," he said. "I wasn't sure you would. You've won everything. You didn't need to come. So I assume you came for a reason that isn't business, because you've already taken all the business there is to take." He gestured to the chair across from him, the chair I'd never been allowed to sit in. "Sit. Whatever you came to say or to ask, I'm too tired and too close to the end to do anything but tell you the truth. I've had 10 years to prepare for this conversation. I never thought I'd actually have to have it. But here you are, in my mother's chair, running my mother's company, and I suppose the truth is the only thing I have left that you haven't already taken." I sat, and I asked the question I'd carried for 10 years, the question underneath all the wars I'd won to avoid asking it. "The will," I said. "Grandmother's will. She left her shares to me. You contested it, and you used it as the reason to throw me out, and you told everyone she was senile at the end. But she wasn't senile, Father. I knew her better than anyone alive, and her mind was a blade until the day she died. So I want the truth, not the public version, the real one. What did the will actually say, and what did you actually do?" My father was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the city full of buildings his mother had built. And then he told me, and the truth was worse and stranger and more human than I'd imagined, and it broke something in me even as it explained everything. "The will didn't just leave you her shares," he said. "That was the part we made public, because it was the part we could fight, the part we could frame as a sick old woman's sentiment. The real will, the full will, the one my lawyers buried, did something else. My mother left you her shares, yes. But she also left a letter, addressed to the board, to be read upon her death, that named you, an 18-year-old girl, as her chosen successor. Not Leo, not me, you. She wrote that she had trained you in secret for 10 years, that you were the only descendant who understood what the company actually was, that the men of the family had been coasting on her work for 3 generations and would destroy it within a decade of her death, and that the only way to save the empire she'd built was to put it immediately into the hands of the granddaughter she'd prepared for exactly that purpose." His voice was very quiet. "She saw all of it, Clara. She predicted exactly what Leo would do, exactly how the company would die, exactly the catastrophe you came home to fix. She wrote it down 15 years ago in a letter naming you as the only one who could prevent it. And I buried that letter, and I contested the shares, and I threw you out, because I could not accept that my mother thought a girl, my daughter, was worth more than me and both my sons combined. It wasn't even really about you, it was about her. About being told by my own dying mother, in writing, that the daughter I dismissed was the heir, and I was the failure who'd lose it all. I couldn't bear it. So I buried the truth, and I threw you out, and I told myself I was protecting the natural order, and I spent 10 years watching Leo prove my mother right about every single thing, watching the company die exactly the way she predicted, knowing the whole time that the one person who could have saved it was the daughter I'd walked to the gate, because I couldn't bear to be the man my mother saw. I sat in his mother's chair, in his forbidden study, and I absorbed the full shape of it. And it was so much worse than girls don't inherit, because girls don't inherit was at least an honest prejudice, and this was something more rotted. My grandmother had not just left me her shares, she had named me her successor, seen the entire future, written down the exact catastrophe and the exact solution, and my father had buried her last and clearest wish and thrown me out not because of a doctrine, but because he could not survive being told the truth about his own worth by the one person whose judgment he couldn't dismiss. He'd let his mother's empire die, let 40,000 jobs hang by a thread, let the family nearly collapse, all to avoid facing a letter that said his daughter was worth more than he was. You let it all happen, I said quietly, rather than admit she was right. You watched Leo destroy what she built for 10 years, knowing the whole time that I could have saved it, and you said nothing, because saying something meant admitting that your mother saw what I was and you couldn't bear to see it. 40,000 people almost lost everything, Father. The company almost died. And the reason, the actual root reason under all of it, is that you couldn't survive your own mother thinking a girl was the future. I was not crying, but something in me had gone very still and very cold and very clear. That's the most expensive ego in the history of this family, and that's saying something, because this family is nothing but expensive egos all the way down. I know, my father said. And then he did the thing I had never once seen Arthur Finch do in 18 years of being his daughter. He wept. An old dying man weeping by a window in the wreckage of his certainties. I know. I've known for 10 years. I watched my mother be right about everything, and I watched myself be exactly the failure she named. And I couldn't undo it, because undoing it meant admitting it. And admitting it was the one thing I'd thrown you out to avoid. And then you came back, and you sat in her chair, and you sound exactly like her, and you sit exactly like her, and you saved the company in 2 months the way she said you would. And every single thing she wrote in that letter came true in front of me. And I am dying knowing that my mother was right, and I was wrong, and that I cost you 10 years and the company a decade and 40,000 people their security, all because I couldn't bear to be the lesser child. He looked at me, and the dying man's eyes held something I'd never seen in them, the thing I'd waited 10 years for without knowing it was the thing I wanted. She was right about you, Clara. She was right about everything. You are worth more than me and both your brothers combined. You always were. I knew it the day I read her letter, and I buried it, and I threw you out, and I have to die now knowing that the best thing this family ever produced is the child I discarded, and that the only reason the company my mother built still exists is that the daughter I threw away was strong enough to build her own empire and come back and save ours despite us. I'm not asking for forgiveness. There's no forgiveness for what I did, and you'd be a fool to give it. And you're not a fool. You're the least foolish person I've ever met. I'm just telling you the truth, finally, the way I should have 10 years ago. You were the heir. She chose you. You were always the heir. And I'm sorry, for whatever a dying man's sorry is worth, which is nothing, which is less than nothing. But it's the only thing I have left to give you that you haven't already taken for yourself. I sat with my father's confession in my grandmother's chair, and I want to tell you what I felt, because it wasn't triumph, and it wasn't even the cold satisfaction of being proven right. It was grief. Grief for the 10 years. Grief for my grandmother who'd seen everything and written it down and been buried by her own son. Grief for the girl at the gate who'd been told she didn't count when a letter existed, the whole time, in a drawer, saying she counted more than anyone. And under the grief, something I hadn't expected, something my grandmother would have understood, a kind of terrible peace, because the truth was finally out, finally said, finally real. And I had spent 10 years not knowing whether the gate had been about a doctrine or about something deeper. And now I knew. And knowing, even when the knowing was this ugly, was better than the 10 years of not knowing. I'm not going to forgive you, I said. You're right that I'd be a fool to, and I'm not a fool. But I'm going to tell you something because you finally told me the truth, and the truth deserves a truth in return. I looked at my grandmother's empire out the window, the empire that was mine now, the way she'd wanted. I didn't come back for forgiveness, and I didn't come back for revenge. I came back because she asked me to, the night she died, without knowing she was asking. She told me they'd try to take everything, and to make sure the most important thing was the one thing they couldn't reach. And the most important thing wasn't the shares or the company, or even the proof that I could build my own empire. The most important thing was this: the truth. What actually happened, whether she was right, and you've just given it to me, the one thing I came home for, the thing no war could win and no fortune could buy, the confirmation that she saw me, and chose me, and was right, and that the only reason it took 10 years was a man too small to bear his own mother's clear sight. I stood. So here's what's going to happen, Father. You're going to die, soon, and I'm going to run the company my grandmother built and you nearly let die. and I'm going to run it well, and I'm going to put her name back where it belongs, as the founder, the real one, the woman the gala speeches erased. The history is going to be corrected. Lillian Hawthorne built this, and the world is going to know it, finally, because I'm going to make sure of it. That's her real inheritance, the one you tried to bury, not the shares, the truth. And I'm the one she trusted to deliver it, and I will, all of it, the way she wanted, the way you couldn't bear. I walked to the door of the forbidden study. Goodbye, Father. I won't say I'm glad we had this conversation because glad is the wrong word for any of this. But it needed to be said, and now it's said, and I can finally stop carrying the question because I finally have the answer. She was right. She was always right. And the most expensive thing this family ever did was refuse, for 3 generations, to listen to the women who actually knew how to build. After my father told me the truth, before I dealt with the rest of the family, I went to my grandmother's grave, alone, for the first time in 10 years. I'd avoided it the whole time I'd been back. I'd told myself there was no time, that the company came first, that sentiment was hot, and I didn't do hot things. But the truth, which I can admit now, is that I couldn't face her grave until I'd earned the right to stand at it, until I'd taken back what was hers and learned what my father did and could finally tell her, fully, that the bet she made on a girl in a locked study had paid off, every part of it, exactly as she'd seen. You don't go to the grave of the person who believed in you until you've become the thing they believed you'd be. I went the day I finally had. It was a quiet cemetery, well kept, and her stone said only her name and her dates. No founder, no truth, just Lillian Hawthorne and the years. Because the men who'd buried her wish had buried her stone the same way. Plain, modest, a woman's stone, giving nothing away of the empire she'd built. I would change that too, I decided, standing there. The stone would tell the truth, the way the lobby would, the way the history would. But that day I didn't come to change anything. I came to report. I took it back, I told her. I felt foolish for about 3 seconds, talking to a stone, and then I didn't, because she'd taught me that the foolish-feeling things are often the true ones, and the people who can't bear to feel foolish never learn anything real. All of it. The company, the chair, the truth. I sat in your chair. I run your empire. Leo nearly killed it, exactly the way you said he would, and I saved it, exactly the way you said I would, in the letter they buried. I read your letter finally. Father confessed. He buried it for 10 years because he couldn't bear that you chose me. He let the company die rather than admit you were right. I stopped. You were right. About everything. You saw the whole future in that letter, 15 years out, every detail. And you were right about every single thing, including me, including that I could do it. You bet everything on an 8-year-old in a locked study, against all of them, and you won the bet 12 years after you died, and I just wanted to come here and tell you that you won. You weren't senile. You weren't wrong. You weren't a silent woman behind a man's signature. You were the builder, the only one this family ever produced until me, and you saw clearly when no one else could. And you were right. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows it. The wind moved in the trees. I am not a person who believes in signs, and I won't pretend the wind was her. But I'll tell you that standing at that plain stone, having finally earned the right to stand there, I felt the thing I'd been chasing under all the wars and all the cold, the thing no boardroom victory had quite given me. Not triumph, completion. The closing of a circle that had opened in a locked study when I was 8, that had bent through a gate and a suitcase and 10 years and a buried will, and that closed, finally, at a grave, with a granddaughter telling a grandmother that the bet had paid off, that the knowing had survived, that the lonely, erased genius had achieved the only immortality her time and place allowed, which was a girl who carried the thing inside her head through everything they did and brought it home. You told me to make sure the most important thing was the one thing they couldn't reach, I said. I did. They reached everything else. The house, the name, the inheritance, 10 years of my life. They never reached the thing you put in my head. It carried me through all of it, exactly like you said it would, and it brought me back. And now it's in the next one. A girl named Chloe, 23, brilliant, overlooked, the way I was, the way you must have been. I'm teaching her, in the quiet, the way you taught me. The chain goes on. That's the thing they can never reach, the chain, the knowing. passed woman to woman where they can't see. You started it, in a locked study, refusing to let your knowing die with you. I'm a link. Chloe's the next. It goes on past all of us, past any empire, past any gate. That's your real legacy, grandmother. Not the company, the chain. And it's unbreakable, because it was never in the house. It was always only in our heads, where they never thought to look. I stood at her grave a while longer, in the quiet, and then I went back to the work, because she would have wanted me at the work, not the grave, the factory running, not the sentiment. But I went back changed, the circle closed, the report made, the bet confirmed, paid in full. The cold had carried me through the wars. The grave gave me the thing the cold couldn't, the peace of a debt acknowledged, a believer vindicated, a circle closed. And I have gone back to that grave every year since, on the day she died, to report the year's building, because the dead who believed in us deserve to know how the bet turned out, and because the chain includes the gratitude, the looking back, the standing at the plain stone and saying, "You were right, you won, thank you," it goes on. My father died 6 weeks after our conversation, and in the time between, I dealt with the rest of the family, one at a time, the cold way, the just way, the way that was neither the cruelty they'd shown me, nor the mercy they hadn't earned, but something my grandmother would have recognized as simply giving each person exactly what they were worth. Leo came to me first, because Leo, stripped of the chairmanship and exposed as the agent of the company's decline, had nowhere else to go. He came without the golden air confidence, which I'd never seen him without, and he sat across my desk, and he didn't bluster, and he didn't demand. And I understood that 2 months of watching his discarded sister save the company he'd nearly destroyed had done something to him that 30 years of being handed everything never had. It had introduced him to reality. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending I deserve anything," he said. "I had everything. I was given the chair you should have had, the chair grandmother wanted you to have. I know that now. Father told me before he told me about the letter. I had everything and I lost it. And you had nothing, and you built an empire and came back and saved the one I lost. There's no version of this where I get to feel sorry for myself." He looked at his hands. "So I'm just going to ask, is there anything in this company I can do that's actually useful? Not a position because I'm a Ellington. I've had that my whole life and it nearly killed the company. A real job, something I could actually be good at, if I started over at the bottom and learned it for real, the way you must have learned everything at the bottom when we threw you out. I don't expect you to say yes. I'd understand a no. But I'd rather ask for a real job and be refused than be given a fake one out of pity, because I've finally understood, watching you, that the fake ones are what destroyed me." And I looked at my brother, the golden heir who'd been ruined by being given everything, and I saw, for the first time, something that might be the beginning of a person, and I made a decision that wasn't soft and wasn't cruel, just true. "There's a regional operations role," I said. "Real responsibility, real consequences, no special treatment, and you'll report to one of the executives you fired, who I brought back, and who remembers exactly what you did. If you can humble yourself enough to learn from the people you dismissed, and if you're actually any good once you're not coasting on the name, you'll rise on the merits, the way I had to. And if you're not good, you'll fall, on the merits, the way you should have years ago. That's the offer. It's the same offer I'd give a stranger, which is the most respect I've ever shown you, because for the first time I'm treating you as someone who has to earn his place instead of someone who inherits it." Leo took it. And I'll tell you, looking ahead, that he was mediocre at first and then slowly, genuinely good. Because it turned out that under the ruin of being given everything, there was a real person who'd simply never been required to become one, and the requiring made him. He's a competent executive now, earning his place, and the relationship between us will never be warm, but it became, over years, something like respect, which is more than either of us ever expected. Julian was simpler, because Julian was a thief, and theft is not a thing you rehabilitate with a regional operations role. The 4.2 million was real, the evidence was complete, and I let the law have him, not out of cruelty, but because some things are simply consequences, and a man who embezzles from a company in crisis, while 40,000 jobs hang in the balance, has earned his consequences. Vivian begged me to spare her son. The only time I ever saw Vivian beg, and I told her the truth. "I'm not punishing Julian, Vivian. I'm declining to protect him from what he did. There's a difference, and it's the same difference you never understood the day you threw me out. The world has consequences, and shielding people from their consequences doesn't make them safe. It makes them worse, which is exactly what you did to Julian his whole life, and it's why he's a thief. I'm not going to do to him what you did to him. I'm going to let him face the truth of his actions, which is the one gift you never gave him. And maybe, at the bottom, he'll find the thing Leo found, the requirement to become a real person. Or maybe he won't. But that's his to discover, with the consequences. The way I discovered who I was with mine, at a gate, with a suitcase. Vivian herself I did not destroy, though I could have, and she knew I could have, and that knowledge was its own punishment. I simply removed her from every position of influence in the company and the family, stripped her of the power she'd spent 15 years accumulating, and left her to live out her years as exactly what she'd feared most. Nothing. Not poor. I provided for her modestly, for the complicated reason that my grandmother would have, because cruelty is hot, and I don't do hot things, but powerless, irrelevant, watching from the outside as the daughter she'd schemed to displace ran the empire she'd schemed to control. You spent 15 years, I told her, in our last real conversation, making sure the inheritance went to your boy instead of me. And your prize is watching your boy go to prison and the girl you displaced run everything, while you become the thing you were terrified of becoming, a woman with no power and no relevance, watching from the edge. I didn't do that to you, Vivian. You did it to yourself. With every scheme, every manipulation, every share of affection you redirected away from a daughter toward a son who couldn't carry it. The cold truth is that if you'd simply let my grandmother's wish stand, if you'd let the company go to the heir she chose, you'd have been the powerful stepmother of a thriving dynasty instead of the powerless relic of a ruined one. Your scheming didn't get you power. It cost you everything, slowly, over 15 years. And you never saw it, because you were too busy being certain that displacing the girl was the path to securing the boy. It was the opposite. It always was. And now you get to spend the rest of your life knowing it. That was Vivian's punishment. Not poverty, understanding. It was, I think, the worst thing I could have done to her, and it was also, technically, just the truth, which is the only weapon I've ever needed. Isabella, the cousin who'd been positioned as my replacement, the daughter the family had wanted instead of me, surprised me, the way Leo surprised me. She came to me not to beg or scheme, but to apologize, genuinely, for a thing she'd been a child for and had spent years feeling complicit in. I was 14 when they threw you out, she said. I didn't understand it then. I understood it later, what they'd done, what I'd been used for, the replacement daughter. The proof that the family could have a girl it approved of as long as she knew her place and didn't have your fire. I've felt sick about it for years. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, and that I always knew, even as a kid, that they'd done something wrong to you, and I'm ashamed I benefited from it. And I looked at Isabella, who'd been a pawn the way I'd been a casualty, both of us used by the family's machinery, and I offered her something I hadn't planned to. Then stop benefiting from it and start earning your own place, like everyone else now has to. There's a role if you want it, a real one, on the same terms as Leo, no special treatment. The family's old machinery is gone. There's only worth now. Show me yours. She took it and she was good, genuinely good, and she became, over time, the closest thing to a real family member I have in that whole rotted clan. The cousin who'd been used as my replacement becoming, on the merits, an actual colleague, which my grandmother would have appreciated as the kind of irony that's also justice. And then there was Gabriel. He came after the worst of it was done, after my father's confession and the family's reckoning, the way he'd promised years ago that he'd be there after. I'd told him no when he offered to be in the boardroom. I'd had to walk into that room alone, because I'd been thrown out of it alone. But the after was different, and the after was his, the way it had been his for years. And when he came to the chairman's office and found me beneath my grandmother's restored photograph, surrounded by the empire I'd reclaimed and the family I'd reckoned with, and the 10 years of wait finally set down, he didn't congratulate me, and he didn't ask how it felt, because Gabriel never reached for the obvious thing. He just looked at the photograph of Lillian Hawthorne on the wall and said, "She'd be proud of you. Not for the company, for how you did it. Results instead of ashes. The cold without the cruelty. You took it all back and you didn't become them. That's the hardest thing, and you did it, and she'd know exactly how hard it was because she did it too, in a world even worse than yours. He turned to me. I told you, years ago, that someday the world should know your name. You said it never would, that the whole point was to never be seen. And I've thought about that a lot over the years, watching you build, and I think you were half right. He came to stand beside me, beneath my grandmother's photograph, the one person who'd seen me whole before I came with an empire. The world doesn't need to know your name. You're right about that. The invisibility is your power, the way it was hers. But there should be one person who knows it, all the way down, the whole truth, the gate, and the suitcase, and the 10 years, and the grandmother, and the cold, and the reason for the cold. There should be one person who sees the woman under the strategist, and knows exactly what she cost herself to become, and stays. I've been that person for years, Claire, without you ever quite letting yourself need it. I'm asking you to let me keep being it, not as your partner in business. You don't need a partner in business. You've never needed help with anything. As the one person who knows your name, the whole truth, for the rest of it. He took my hand on the equal terms that were the only terms I'd ever been able to accept, the terms he'd offered from the first deal he'd lost to me. Let me be the one who knows. Everyone else gets the strategist. Let me have Claire. I've wanted the job for years and I've never wanted any other. And I, who had spent 10 years being seen wrong by everyone, who'd been thrown out by a family that couldn't imagine my worth and underestimated by a market that couldn't believe it, looked at the one person who'd seen me right before there was anything in it for him, beneath the photograph of the grandmother who'd seen me right before anyone else, and I let myself, for the first time in 10 years, need something. The job's yours, I said. It always was. I just needed to take back everything they stole before I could let myself have the one thing they couldn't touch. I looked up at my grandmother's photograph, the woman who'd told me to make sure the most important thing was the one thing they couldn't reach. She told me the most important thing was the truth. She was right, the way she was right about everything. But there's one thing she didn't tell me, because she never got it for herself, in a world that wouldn't allow it. The most important thing is the truth. And the second most important thing is one person who knows it and stays. I took Gabriel's hand, beneath Lillian Hawthorne's restored photograph, in the chairman's chair she'd died trying to give me. You've been that person for years. I'm sorry it took me reclaiming an empire to admit I wanted you to keep being it. But I'm admitting it now. So stay. Know my name. All of it. For the rest of it. And the cold, for the first time in 10 years, had something warm at its center. And I let it, because my grandmother, for all her brilliance, had spent her life cold all the way through, alone, seen by no one. And I had decided in that chair that I would honor her by being everything she was except that, and that the honoring would include the one thing she never got, a witness who knew the whole name and stayed. A year later, I can tell you how it all settled, because the settling is where the reclaiming finally becomes the building, and the building was always the point, the way it was always my grandmother's point, under the cold, under the wars, under the 100 years of men taking the credit. The Ellington Group did not just recover, it thrived, the way it hadn't thrived since my grandmother ran it from the shadows behind her husband's signature. Freed from the vanity and the theft and the flatterers, restored to the loyal people who actually knew how it worked, run for the first time in 3 generations by someone who understood it the way Lillian had, the company became, within a year, healthier and larger and more genuinely valuable than it had been in decades. The 40,000 jobs were secure, and then there were more jobs, because a company that's run well grows, and a company that grows hires. The creditors who'd been preparing for a bankruptcy became partners in an expansion. And the market that had dismissed the dying dynasty watched, with the particular astonishment it reserves for being proven wrong, as the Ellington Group transformed from a cautionary tale into one of the great turnaround stories of the decade, under a chairman whose full story almost no one knew. Because I stayed invisible mostly, the way my grandmother taught me, the way I'd always been. The world knew that the Ellington Group had been rescued and revitalized by its new chairman, Clara Ellington, the founder's granddaughter who'd been estranged from the family and returned. But the world did not know that Clara Ellington was the strategist, that the rescue had been mounted by Halcyon, that the chairman of the recovering dynasty was secretly one of the largest private fortunes on the planet. I kept Halcyon separate, invisible, mine, because the invisibility was my power the way it had been hers, and because I'd learned at a gate exactly what the world does to a visible woman with power. Let them think Clara Ellington was a capable heiress who'd come home and turned the company around. The truth, the full scale of what I was, stayed where the real power always lives, in the quiet, where my grandmother kept it her whole life. But there was one thing I made visible, deliberately, completely, the one piece of the truth I refused to leave in the shadows, because it was hers and not mine, and she'd spent her whole life being erased, and I had the power now to undo the erasing. And I did. I corrected the history. I had the company's official record rewritten, the gala speech rewritten, the plaques and the corporate biography and the founding story all rewritten, to tell the truth that had been buried for 100 years. That the Ellington Group was founded, built, and saved from death 3 generations apart by 2 women, Lillian Hawthorne, who created it from nothing in an age that wouldn't let her sign her own name to it, and Clara Ellington, who reclaimed it from the men who'd nearly killed it. I had Lillian's portrait, the real one, hung in the lobby where her husband's had hung for a century, with the true story beneath it. Founder, the woman who built this, and was not permitted to say so until her granddaughter made it possible. I unveiled it myself, at a ceremony I made the whole company attend, and I said, to 40,000 employees and the press and the family who'd erased her, the only speech I've ever given. For 100 years, this company has told a story about great men who built it. That story is a lie. This company was built by a woman, my grandmother, Lillian Hawthorne, who created an industrial empire with her own mind and her own hands in an age that wouldn't let a woman sign a loan, and who watched the men of this family take the credit for her work, decade after decade, until the official history erased her completely. She knew she was being erased, and she did the only thing she could to fight it. She found, among her descendants, the one child who had her mind, and she trained that child in secret, and she left that child everything, with a letter naming her the heir, because she knew the men would destroy what she'd built. And she was right. They did. And only the heir she chose could save it. And the heir she chose did. I am that heir. I was thrown out of this family at 18 because the men could not bear that a woman had been named worth more than them. I spent 10 years building my own empire, and I came back and saved this one, exactly as my grandmother predicted I would, in a letter they buried for 10 years. So I am standing here today to do the one thing she never got to do, which is tell the truth out loud, in the lobby of the company she built, in front of everyone. Lillian Hawthorne built this. Not her husband, not her sons, her. And the reason this company still exists, the reason your jobs still exist, is 2 women, 100 years apart, who were told girls don't inherit, and who built and reclaimed an empire anyway. Look up at her portrait when you come to work. That's the founder. That's the truth. It only took 100 years and a granddaughter with enough power to make it impossible to bury. It's buried no longer. It never will be again. The portrait hangs there still. Founder. The truth, finally, undeniable, in the lobby of the empire she built. That was my grandmother's real inheritance, the one my father tried to bury, the one no war and no fortune could deliver, only the power to make the truth visible and the will to use it. I delivered it. It was the only thing I ever made loud, in a life built on being quiet, and I made it loud because she never could, and because some truths have been silent too long. People ask me, the very few who know the full story, whether I forgave my father before he died. And I tell them the truth, which is complicated, the way the true things always are. I didn't forgive him. There's no forgiveness for burying his own mother's last wish and throwing out his daughter and letting a company die rather than admit he was the lesser child. But I sat with him, at the end, in the weeks before he died, and we talked, not as forgiver and forgiven, but as 2 people who'd finally told each other the truth. And there was a kind of peace in it that wasn't forgiveness, but wasn't war either. The peace of a thing finally being seen clearly by everyone involved. He died knowing his mother was right, and his daughter was the best thing the family ever made. And I let him die knowing it, not as a gift, but because it was simply true. and the truth was the only currency that ever passed honestly between us. It was enough. It had to be. It was more than the gate had given me, and less than a real father would have, which is, I've found, what most things turn out to be. And Leo and Isabella earned their places, and Julian faced his consequences, and Vivian lived out her years in the powerless understanding she'd earned, and the family, the rotted machinery of girls don't inherit, was finally fully dismantled, replaced by the only thing my grandmother ever wanted at the heart of her empire: worth, and nothing else. No gender, no birth order, no name, just whether you could actually do the thing, the way the factory either runs or it doesn't. Gabriel knows my name. All of it. He's the one person who does, the witness my grandmother never got, and the cold has something warm at its center now, and I let it, because honoring her means being everything she was except alone. We built our lives the way two equals build a life, quietly, invisibly, on terms of perfect mutual respect. And it is the one thing in my life that isn't a transaction or a war or a reclaiming, the one thing that's simply freely mine. And I almost didn't let myself have it, and I'm glad past words that I did. My family threw me out with nothing when I was 18, because girls don't inherit. And they were right. We don't inherit. My grandmother didn't inherit. She built, in the shadows, an empire that men took the credit for. I didn't inherit. I built, in the shadows, an empire of my own. And then I came back and took the one they'd stolen. We don't inherit, the women of this family. We do something so much more permanent. We build, with our own minds and our own hands, the thing they say we can't. And we build it so well and so completely that when we finally come back to take what was always ours, there's nothing they can do to stop us. Because you cannot argue with a factory that runs, and you cannot bury a truth forever. And you cannot keep a woman from her grandmother's empire when the grandmother trained her for exactly that, and saw the whole future, and was right about every single thing. They said girls don't inherit. They were right. We build, we reclaim, we correct the history. We hang the founder's true portrait in the lobby 100 years late. And we run the empire they nearly destroyed better than any of them ever could, in the quiet, where the real power has always lived, with the founder watching from the wall, finally named, finally seen, finally home. I sat down in my father's chair. It was never his chair. It was always hers. And now it's mine, the way she wanted, the way she saw, the way she knew. 100 years and 3 generations and 10 years at a gate too late, but not too late, never too late, because the truth waited, and the heir waited, and the empire waited. And in the end, the woman they threw away came home and took her grandmother's chair and told the truth out loud in the lobby and built the future on it. Girls don't inherit. We do something better. We come back and we take it all, and we make it true.